Hey guys, tonight we dive into one of the most haunting and misunderstood mysteries in all of Game of Thrones, the transformation of Aerys Targaryen from a beloved young prince into the Mad King whose final words, "Burn them all," would echo through history forever. But what if I told you that everything we think we know about his madness is wrong? What if the truth buried beneath centuries of lies reveals not a madman, but perhaps the greatest unsung hero Westeros has ever known? This is the story of ancient conspiracies, prophetic visions, and a king who willingly sacrificed his sanity to save a realm that would forever remember him as a monster. It's about hidden orders operating in shadows, Valyrian blood magic that survived the doom, and secrets so dangerous that maesters have spent decades ensuring they never see the light of day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Red Keep stands silent in the pre-dawn darkness, its ancient stones holding secrets that would shake the very foundations of Westeros if they were ever revealed. In the deepest chamber beneath the Iron Throne, a figure moves through shadows that seem to dance with unnatural life. King Aerys Targaryen, second of his name, stands before a mirror of black glass, but the reflection staring back is not his own. The face in the glass is older, marked by fire and time, with eyes that burn like molten gold. When it speaks, its voice carries the weight of centuries. The wall grows thin. Young dragon, the cold ones stir in the lands of always winter. Your blood must burn brighter now, or all will fall to endless night. Aerys presses his palms against the glass, and where his skin touches, flames bloom beneath the surface. "I see them in my dreams," he whispers, his voice trembling not with madness, but with the terrible burden of prophecy. "I see the dead walking, the dragons that must wake, the fire that must burn. But the price of seeing is..." The vision cuts away like smoke, leaving only questions hanging in the air like wildfire waiting to ignite. This moment, hidden from every history book, every maester's chronicle, every song sung in taverns across the Seven Kingdoms, holds the key to understanding one of the most complex figures in Westerosi history. For you see, Aerys Targaryen was not driven to madness by the trauma of Duskendale, nor by the inherent instability that supposedly plagued his bloodline. The truth is far more extraordinary and far more tragic. What drove the Mad King to line the walls of King's Landing with wildfire was not paranoia but preparation. What made him trust no one was not madness, but the crushing weight of secrets that could not be shared. And what made him whisper, "Burn them all," in his final moments was not the ravings of a broken mind, but the echo of a prophecy that stretched back to old Valyria itself. Tonight we will uncover the hidden chambers beneath Dragonstone, where ancient rituals were performed. We will decode the encrypted letters that reveal a conspiracy spanning 3 centuries. We will meet the mysterious figures who called themselves the Order of the Dragon's Eye, and learn how they shaped not just Aerys' reign, but the very course of Westerosi history. We will discover why Robert's rebellion was not the tragic result of a king's madness, but a carefully orchestrated event designed to position the right pieces for a war that was always coming. We will learn the true meaning behind the 3-headed dragon and why Aerys' apparent madness was actually the price he paid for the most precious gift imaginable in a world where winter is always coming: the ability to see the future. But most importantly, we will understand that sometimes the greatest heroes are those who allow themselves to be remembered as villains, and that true nobility sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice, not just of life, but of legacy itself. The Game of Thrones was never about who sits on the Iron Throne. It was about preparing the realm for a threat that most believed was nothing more than legend, and at the center of it all was a king who chose to bear the weight of prophecy, knowing it would cost him everything, including his place in history. So settle in, because tonight we will rewrite everything you thought you knew about the Mad King, and reveal the extraordinary truth behind one of the most tragic figures in all of Game of Thrones. Our story begins in the ancient halls of the Citadel in Old Town, where the greatest library in all of Westeros holds secrets that span thousands of years. The morning sun filters through stained glass windows, casting dancing shadows across rows upon rows of scrolls, tomes, and manuscripts that chronicle the rise and fall of kingdoms. But in the deepest vaults, beneath layers of dust and locked behind doors that haven't been opened in decades, lie the records that the Meisters would prefer remained buried forever. Here, in these forgotten chambers, we meet our guide into this mystery, Maester Qyburn, not the infamous figure who would later serve Cersei Lannister, but a much younger man, barely past his chains, with an insatiable hunger for knowledge that the older Meisters find troubling. His pale hands move with practiced precision as he catalogues ancient texts, but his sharp green eyes constantly search for inconsistencies, for the gaps between official history and whispered rumors. Qyburn has dedicated the past 3 years to studying the Targaryen lineage, initially drawn by the academic challenge of tracing bloodlines through conquest and civil war. But the deeper he delves into the records, the more he realizes that something fundamental about the accepted history doesn't make sense. The transformation of Aerys from beloved prince to Mad King is too abrupt, too complete, and far too convenient for those who benefited from his downfall. The smell of old parchment and melting candle wax fills the air as Qyburn works late into the night, surrounded by towers of books that chronicle 3 centuries of Targaryen rule. Each volume tells the same story, a noble house blessed and cursed with dragons, gradually succumbing to the madness that comes with power. But between the lines, in the margins of personal letters and the coded language of diplomatic correspondence, another story begins to emerge. It is Archmaester Walgrave who first notices Qyburn's obsession with the inconsistencies in Targaryen history. The elderly Maester, his mind still sharp despite his advancing years, approaches the young scholar with a mixture of curiosity and concern. His gray robes rustle softly as he moves between the shelves, and when he speaks, his voice carries the weight of decades spent guarding dangerous knowledge. "You've been asking questions about the reign of Aerys II," Walgrave observes, settling into a chair across from Qyburn's workspace. "Specifically about the period before Duskendale, when he was still considered one of the more promising Targaryen kings." Qyburn looks up from a letter he's been studying, one written in Aerys's own hand just months after his coronation. The handwriting is steady, the language clear and rational, speaking of plans to improve the realm's defenses and strengthen trade relationships. It bears no resemblance to the paranoid ravings that would characterize his later correspondence. "There's something wrong with the timeline," Qyburn says, spreading several documents across the table. "Look at these letters, written over a span of just 2 years. The change in his handwriting, his vocabulary, even his concerns, it's as if 2 completely different people were writing them." Walgrave examines the documents with practiced eyes, noting details that only a lifetime of studying such materials could reveal. The ink composition changes subtly between letters. The paper stock varies in ways that suggest different sources. Most tellingly, certain phrases appear repeatedly in the later letters, phrases that have no precedent in Aerys's earlier writings, but match the language found in much older texts. "What you've discovered," Walgrave says quietly, glancing around to ensure they are alone, "is why certain archives remain restricted. Some knowledge is considered too dangerous for young maesters to pursue. But Qyburn's curiosity has been kindled beyond any hope of containment. Over the following weeks, he begins to notice other anomalies, references to meetings that don't appear in any official records, mentions of advisors who seem to have no historical existence. Most intriguingly, repeated allusions to something called the Dragon Dreams Protocol, a phrase that appears in Targaryen correspondence dating back to the conquest itself. The breakthrough comes when Qyburn discovers a loose stone in the wall of one of the oldest archive chambers. Behind it, wrapped in oiled leather and hidden for decades, is a collection of documents that should not exist. Personal letters between Aerys and someone identified only as the Flame Prophet, detailed instructions for rituals involving fire and blood, and most disturbing of all, accurate predictions of events that wouldn't occur until years after the letters were written. As Qyburn reads these hidden documents by flickering candlelight, he realizes that he has stumbled upon something far more significant than academic inconsistencies. The Mad King's transformation was not the result of inherent Targaryen madness or traumatic experiences. It was deliberate, orchestrated, and part of a plan that stretched back centuries before his birth. The weight of this revelation settles over him like a heavy cloak. Every official history he has studied, every song sung about the Mad King, every justification for Robert's rebellion suddenly appears in a completely different light. If Aerys was not truly mad, if his actions served some greater purpose, then the very foundations of current Westerosi power structures were built upon a lie. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside forces Qyburn to quickly hide the documents. But he knows there is no going back. He has glimpsed behind the curtain of official history, and what he has seen cannot be unseen. The questions that burn in his mind now will not be satisfied by dusty tomes and careful cataloging. They demand investigation, exploration, and the courage to challenge everything the realm believes about one of its most infamous kings. As dawn breaks over Old Town, painting the ancient city in shades of gold and amber, he will uncover the truth behind Aerys Targaryen's transformation, no matter where that truth leads or what powerful interests he might disturb in the process. The mystery of the Mad King calls to him with the irresistible pull of forbidden knowledge, and he knows he must answer that call. The game has begun, though Qyburn does not yet realize that he is now a player in a story that started long before his birth and will continue long after his death. The decision to pursue the truth about Aerys Targaryen consumed Qyburn's thoughts like wildfire consuming dry timber. For 3 days after discovering the hidden documents, he went through the motions of his regular duties, cataloging minor texts and assisting senior maesters with their research, but his mind remained fixed on the impossible correspondence he had found. The Flame Prophet's letters spoke of events with such precision that they could only have been written by someone who possessed genuine prophetic sight, yet no such figure existed in any historical record. On the 4th morning, as autumn mist rolled in from the Honeywine River and shrouded Old Town in grey veils, Qyburn made his way to Archmaester Walgrave's private study. The elderly maester's chambers occupied the highest floor of one of the citadel's oldest towers, reached by a winding stair that had been worn smooth by centuries of scholarly feet. Tapestries depicting the history of the maesters lined the walls, their colors faded but their stories still vivid to those who knew how to read them. Walgrave was seated at his desk when Qyburn entered, examining a manuscript through a magnifying lens of Myrish glass. Without looking up, he gestured for the younger maester to take a seat in the chair positioned opposite his workspace. The morning light filtering through the narrow windows cast long shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere of quiet contemplation that had witnessed countless important conversations over the years. "You've been thinking about what you discovered," Walgrave observed, finally setting down his lens and fixing Qyburn with a steady gaze. "The look in your eyes tells me that you've reached a decision, one that will likely take you far from these comfortable chambers." Qyburn leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together. "The documents I found change everything we know about Aerys Targaryen's reign. If they're authentic, and every test I can devise suggests they are, then the Mad King was not mad at all. He was following instructions from someone who could see the future with impossible clarity. The Archmaester rose from his chair and walked to one of the tall windows, gazing out at the sprawling city below. Old Town stretched toward the horizon, its red-tiled roofs and winding streets telling the story of thousands of years of continuous habitation. Ships filled the harbor, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope that swayed gently in the morning breeze. "There are chambers beneath this very building," Walgrave said quietly, "that contain materials dating back to the earliest days of the Citadel's founding. Documents that predate the conquest, scrolls written in Old Valyrian that speak of practices the Maesters officially condemned centuries ago. The knowledge exists, young Qyburn, but it exists in shadows for very good reasons." Qyburn felt his pulse quicken at the implication. "You're saying the Citadel has known about this conspiracy all along?" Walgrave turned from the window, his expression grave. "I'm saying that some truths are too dangerous to be widely known. The order that has maintained stability in Westeros for 3 centuries depends upon certain beliefs being accepted without question. When those beliefs are challenged, kingdoms fall and thousands die." The two men regarded each other in silence for several moments, the weight of unspoken knowledge hanging between them like morning mist. Finally, Walgrave moved to a section of his bookshelf that appeared no different from any other, but when he pressed against a particular volume, a hidden panel slid aside to reveal a narrow compartment. From within, he withdrew a small iron key, its surface black with age and worn smooth by countless hands. "The restricted archives beneath the Seneschal's tower," he said, holding the key toward Qyburn. "What you seek to understand began long before Aerys Targaryen drew his first breath. The patterns you've noticed in his correspondence echo similar patterns found in documents dating back to the reign of Aegon the Conqueror himself, perhaps even earlier." Qyburn accepted the key with trembling fingers, understanding that he was being offered access to knowledge that few Maesters in the Citadel's history had been permitted to see. The metal felt cold against his palm, but it seemed to pulse with the weight of the secrets it could unlock. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. "If this knowledge is so dangerous, why risk exposing it?" Walgrave returned to his desk and sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his considerable years. "Because I am old, and I have carried certain burdens for longer than any man should. Because the signs are beginning to appear again, the same omens that preceded Aerys' transformation, and because there are forces moving in the world that require someone with your particular combination of curiosity and discretion to understand them." The Archmaester opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a leather portfolio tied with red silk cord. As he placed it on the desktop, Qyburn could see that it bulged with documents, suggesting years of accumulated research. "This contains everything I've been able to gather about the Order of the Dragon's Eye over the past 4 decades, Walgrave explained. References scattered across hundreds of different sources, patterns that only become visible when viewed across centuries rather than years. They've been operating in secret since before the doom of Valyria, preserving ancient knowledge and guiding the bloodlines of dragon lords toward purposes that ordinary men cannot comprehend." Qyburn reached for the portfolio with the same reverence he might show to a religious relic. The silk cord felt smooth beneath his fingers as he untied it, and when he opened the leather cover, he found himself looking at documents that would reshape his understanding of Westerosi history. Maps showing the locations of hidden chambers throughout the 7 kingdoms, genealogical charts that revealed connections between seemingly unrelated noble houses, and at the center of it all, a detailed timeline showing how major events in the realm's history aligned with the appearances of individuals who matched the description of the Flame Prophet. "They've been preparing for something," Walgrave continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "For centuries, they've been positioning pieces on a board so vast that most players cannot even see the edges. Aerys was just one move in a game that began before Aegon's conquest and continues to this day. As Qyburn absorbed the implications of what he was seeing, he began to understand the true scope of the mystery he had stumbled upon. The Mad King's wildfire caches, positioned strategically throughout King's Landing, were not the random preparations of a paranoid ruler. They were placed according to patterns that matched ancient Valyrian defensive strategies, designed to counter threats that had not yet manifested when they were installed. The portfolio contained architectural drawings of the Red Keep that showed chambers and passages not found on any official plans. Hidden rooms where ancient rituals could be performed in secret, connected by tunnels that allowed movement throughout the castle without detection. Most intriguingly, there were references to a chamber deep beneath the Iron Throne itself, where something called the Dragon Glass Mirror was said to be kept. The mirror mentioned in Aerys' correspondence. Qyburn breathed, making the connection. That's where he received his visions, isn't it? Walgrave nodded solemnly. Valyrian glass forged with dragonfire and cooled in the blood of seers. It shows not just the present, but glimpses of possible futures. The price of using it is steep, as Aerys discovered. Each vision burns away a piece of the user's sanity, until eventually they can no longer distinguish between what is real and what might be. The young maester felt a chill run down his spine as he contemplated the implications. If Aerys had been using such a device to guide his decisions, then his apparent madness was actually the gradual cost of trying to save his kingdom from threats that others couldn't even perceive. His paranoia about enemies and traitors took on new meaning when viewed as the reaction of someone who had seen multiple possible futures, many of which involved betrayal and death. "There's more," Walgrave said, producing another document from his desk. Septa Morgwenna, formerly of the Red Keep, now residing at the Sept of Remembrance in King's Landing. She served in the royal household during the early years of Aerys' reign, before his transformation began. Her observations of the king's behavior during that period contradict many of the official accounts. Qyburn examined the letter of introduction Walgrave had prepared, noting the formal seals and careful language that would grant him access to interview the former Septa. The prospect of speaking with someone who had witnessed Aerys' transformation firsthand filled him with anticipation. Official histories could be altered or destroyed, but personal memories carefully preserved and honestly recalled offered a path to truth that no amount of political manipulation could completely obscure. "She has agreed to speak with you," Walgrave continued, "but only because she believes the truth about those years needs to be preserved. The king she served in his early reign bore no resemblance to the monster described in the songs and stories. She watched his transformation with her own eyes, and she knows that something far more complex than simple madness was at work." As the morning progressed and Qyburn absorbed the full scope of the materials Walgrave had entrusted to him, he began to form a plan for his investigation. The restricted archives would provide the historical context, revealing how the Order of the Dragon's Eye had operated across centuries. Septa Morgwenna would offer first-hand testimony about Aerys' transformation, and somewhere in King's Landing itself, in the depths of the Red Keep or hidden in forgotten corners of the ancient city, lay the physical evidence that would prove the conspiracy's existence. The weight of the task ahead settled upon his shoulders like a heavy cloak, but Qyburn found himself energized rather than daunted by the challenge. For too long, the truth about one of Westeros's most pivotal figures had remained buried beneath layers of propaganda and political convenience. The realm deserved to know that the Mad King's actions, however terrible they might have appeared, served purposes that historians had never imagined. "There will be danger in this pursuit," Walgrave warned, as their meeting drew to a close. The Order of the Dragon's Eye did not survive for centuries by allowing their secrets to be exposed carelessly, and there are others, powerful figures in the current political structure, whose authority depends upon the official version of events remaining unquestioned. Qyburn nodded, understanding the risks but unable to turn away from the path that had opened before him. The mystery of Aerys Targaryen called to him with the irresistible pull of forbidden knowledge, and he knew that his scholarly life in the comfortable chambers of the citadel was coming to an end. The truth lay waiting in the shadows of King's Landing, and he would pursue it regardless of the consequences. As he prepared to leave Old Town behind and begin his journey into the heart of the conspiracy, Qyburn reflected on how dramatically his understanding of history had changed in just a few short days. The Mad King was not mad. Robert's rebellion might have been orchestrated, and the entire political structure of Westeros could be built upon a foundation of carefully constructed lies. The Game of Thrones, he now realized, was far more complex than anyone had imagined, and its true players remained hidden in shadows, manipulating events across centuries with patience and skill that defied comprehension. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, left traces for those who knew how to look for them. And Qyburn intended to follow those traces wherever they might lead, even into the very heart of the conspiracy that had shaped the Seven Kingdoms for 300 years. The journey from Old Town to King's Landing took Qyburn through the heart of the Reach, where golden fields stretched endlessly toward horizons that shimmered in the autumn heat. He traveled in the company of merchants and minor nobles, his maester's robes ensuring respectful treatment at every inn and way station along the ancient road. But his mind was not on the comfortable amenities of his journey or the pleasant conversations of his fellow travelers. Instead, he found himself constantly returning to the documents hidden in his travel chest, each reading revealing new layers of complexity in the conspiracy he was pursuing. The restricted archives beneath the Seneschal's tower had yielded treasures beyond his wildest expectations. Ancient scrolls written in High Valyrian spoke of techniques for enhancing prophetic dreams through blood magic and ritual preparation. Genealogical charts showed how certain bloodlines had been carefully preserved and guided across centuries, their marriages and alliances orchestrated to maintain specific magical capabilities. Most significantly, he had discovered records of similar transformations among other Targaryen rulers, patterns that suggested Aerys was not the first king to undergo such dramatic changes in service of hidden purposes. King Bela the Blessed, remembered in the histories as a religious fanatic who nearly destroyed the realm with his piety, had left behind private journals that told a very different story. His supposed madness had begun with prophetic visions that warned of supernatural threats stirring in the far north. His extreme religious devotion was revealed to be preparation for spiritual warfare against forces that ordinary men could not comprehend. Even his controversial decisions, such as locking away his sisters to preserve their purity, took on new meaning when viewed as attempts to preserve bloodlines that carried specific magical properties. The pattern extended further back than Qyburn had initially suspected. King Mago the Cruel, whose reign of terror had nearly ended the Targaryen dynasty before it could fully establish itself, had also left traces of contact with mysterious advisors. His savage treatment of the faith militant was not mere political maneuvering, but part of a systematic elimination of groups that threatened to expose ancient secrets. His construction projects, particularly the completion of the Red Keep with its hidden passages and chambers, followed architectural principles that matched Valyrian fortress design from before the Doom. Each revelation deepened Qyburn's understanding of the scope of the conspiracy, while raising new questions that demanded investigation. The Order of the Dragon's Eye was not merely a secret society preserving ancient knowledge. They were actively shaping the course of Westerosi history, generation after generation, working toward goals that spanned centuries. Their influence extended into every major institution in the realm, from the citadel itself to the Faith of the Seven, from the great noble houses to the humblest merchants and craftsmen. The approach to King's Landing always impressed visitors with its grandeur, but Qyburn found himself studying the ancient city with new eyes as his carriage crested the final hill before beginning the descent toward the capital. The Red Keep dominated the skyline like a crimson crown, its massive walls and towers speaking of power that had endured for 3 centuries. but now he could see the subtle architectural details that marked it as more than a simple fortress. The positioning of certain towers, the angles of specific walls, the placement of gates and courtyards all followed patterns that suggested deeper purposes. Aegon's High Hill was not chosen randomly as the site for the seat of Targaryen power. Ancient texts spoke of the hill as a place where the barriers between the physical world and the realm of spirits grew thin. Valyrian dragonlords had long understood that certain locations possessed inherent magical properties that could enhance their abilities, and the first Targaryen conquerors had recognized such properties in the geography of King's Landing itself. The Sept of Remembrance, where Septa Morgwyna had taken residence after leaving royal service, stood in the shadow of the great Sept of Baelor, its humble stones dwarfed by the magnificent dome and towers of the realm's spiritual center. But Qyburn had learned not to judge significance by outward appearances. The smaller sept had been built on the site of an ancient grove sacred to the old gods, and its foundations incorporated stones that predated Aegon's conquest by thousands of years. Septa Morgwyna received him in a simple chamber lined with religious texts and illuminated by candles that cast dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. She was a woman of middle years, her hair silver-gray beneath her simple head covering, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had spent decades observing the powerful and understanding the subtle currents that moved through royal households. Archmaester Wargrave wrote that you seek to understand the truth about King Aerys, she said, gesturing for Qyburn to take a seat on a wooden bench positioned near the window. I served in the Red Keep for 15 years, from shortly after his coronation until the year before his death. I watched his transformation with my own eyes, and I can tell you that what the histories record bears little resemblance to what actually occurred. Qyburn withdrew a leather journal from his travel bag, prepared to record every detail of her testimony. The Septa's account would provide the personal perspective that official documents could never capture, the human element that would bring the larger conspiracy into focus. Tell me about the early years, he requested. What was Aerys like before the changes began? Morgana's expression softened as she recalled those distant days. He was everything a king should be: intelligent, compassionate, genuinely concerned for the welfare of his subjects. He would spend hours in council meetings, carefully considering every decision and its potential consequences. He was devoted to Queen Rhaethella, kind to his children, respectful to his servants. There was no hint of the madness that would later consume him. She paused, gazing out the window toward the Red Keep that dominated the horizon. But there was something else, something that few people noticed because it seemed so minor at the time. He had dreams, vivid dreams that he would describe in detail to the Queen and his closest advisors. Dreams of dragons flying over frozen wastelands, of dead men walking beneath a sky without stars, of great walls of ice cracking and falling. Qyburn's pen moved rapidly across the page as he recorded her words. The dreams matched descriptions he had found in the hidden documents, prophecies that spoke of threats from beyond the wall that would one day require the united strength of all Westeros to defeat. When did the changes begin? He asked. Gradually, over the course of several months, it started with the arrival of a new advisor, someone who claimed to be a scholar from the Free Cities. He was given chambers in the Tower of the Hand, despite not holding any official position. Lord Tywin was suspicious of him from the beginning, but the king insisted on meeting with him regularly. The Septa's description of this mysterious advisor matched details Qyburn had found in Aerys' secret correspondence. Tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire. He spoke with the accent of old Valyria, though such speech had supposedly died with the Doom centuries earlier. Most significantly, he carried with him artifacts that no living man should have possessed: dragonglass mirrors, books written in scripts that predated the conquest, and rings that bore the symbols of dragonlord houses that had been extinct for generations. The king's behavior began to change after these meetings started. Morgana continued. He would emerge from his conferences with this advisor in a state of barely controlled excitement, speaking of preparations that needed to be made, of ancient prophecies that were beginning to unfold. He started spending long hours in the lower levels of the Red Keep, in chambers that had been sealed since the reign of Magor the Cruel. Qburn felt his pulse quicken at this revelation. The hidden chambers mentioned in the architectural documents he had studied were not merely theoretical constructions. They had been actively used during Aerys' reign, serving as locations for rituals and ceremonies that remained hidden from even the king's closest advisors. "Did you ever see these chambers yourself?" he asked. The scepter shook her head. They were forbidden to all but the king and his mysterious advisor. But I could smell the smoke from the fires they lit down there, smoke that carried strange scents unlike anything produced by normal wood or coal, and sometimes, late at night, we could hear chanting in languages that none of the Meisters could identify. The testimony continued for hours as Morgana described the gradual transformation she had witnessed. The king's handwriting changed, becoming more elaborate and incorporating symbols that had no place in normal Westerosi script. His vocabulary expanded to include words from ancient languages, terms that described concepts and practices that had supposedly been forgotten for centuries. Most disturbing of all, he began to demonstrate knowledge of events that had not yet occurred, speaking with certainty about outcomes that seemed impossible to predict. He knew about Duskendale before it happened, she revealed, her voice dropping to a whisper. Weeks before Lord Darklyn made his move, the king was already preparing for a siege. He had supplies moved to strategic locations, had certain loyalists positioned where they could respond quickly, had even written letters that would be sent to various lords after his rescue was complete. This revelation struck Qburn like a physical blow. The defiance of Duskendale was universally regarded as the event that triggered Aerys' descent into madness, the traumatic experience that shattered his sanity and transformed him into the paranoid tyrant who would eventually be overthrown by Robert Baratheon. But if the king had known about the rebellion in advance, if he had deliberately allowed himself to be captured as part of some larger plan, then the entire accepted narrative collapsed. "You're saying he wanted to be taken prisoner?" Qburn asked, struggling to process the implications. "I'm saying he orchestrated the entire affair," Morgana replied firmly. "The ransom demands, the negotiations, even his rescue by Ser Barristan, all of it followed a script that had been prepared in advance. The supposed trauma of his captivity was performance, designed to provide an excuse for the changes that were already occurring." The scepter went on to describe how Aerys' transformation accelerated after Duskendale, but not in the way the histories recorded. His apparent madness was actually the manifestation of enhanced abilities that allowed him to perceive threats and opportunities that remained invisible to ordinary observers. His paranoia about enemies and conspiracies was grounded in genuine knowledge of plots that others couldn't detect. His obsession with fire and burning was preparation for conflicts that would require such weapons to achieve victory. "The wildfire caches," Qburn said, making the connection. "They weren't the random preparations of a mad king. They were positioned according to plans that the mysterious advisor provided," Morgana confirmed. "Maps that showed the optimal locations for maximum effectiveness against specific types of enemies. The king would spend hours studying these maps, memorizing every detail, preparing for battles that most people believed would never be fought." As their conversation continued into the evening, Qburn began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy that had shaped Aerys' reign. The Order of the Dragon's Eye had not merely influenced the king's decisions, they had orchestrated his entire transformation, using ancient techniques to enhance his prophetic abilities while gradually preparing him for a role that would require the ultimate sacrifice. His reputation, his relationships, even his life would all be forfeit in service of a greater purpose that spanned generations. The final revelation came as Morgana prepared to conclude her testimony. Reaching into a small chest beside her bed, she withdrew an object wrapped in black silk. When she unveiled it, Qyburn found himself looking at a piece of dragon glass no larger than his palm, its surface polished to mirror smoothness and inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the candlelight. "The king gave this to me shortly before I left royal service," she explained. "He said it would help me remember the truth when others tried to convince me that I had imagined what I witnessed. When I look into it, I can still see fragments of the visions that guided his actions. The threats that are coming, the preparations that must be made, the prices that must be paid to preserve the realm." Qyburn accepted the dragon glass with trembling hands, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon him as he held the ancient artifact. Through its surface he caught glimpses of images that defied rational explanation. Armies of the dead marching beneath banners of winter, dragons soaring above battles that had not yet been fought, and always, watching from shadows, figures whose eyes burned with the fire of old Valyria. The truth about Aerys Targaryen was more complex and more terrible than he had imagined, but it was only the beginning of a mystery that reached into the very foundations of the Seven Kingdoms. The Mad King was not mad at all, but rather the latest in a long line of sacrificial pieces in a game whose stakes were nothing less than the survival of all human civilization in Westeros. Armed with Septa Morgwinna's testimony, and the dragon glass artifact that seemed to pulse with ancient power, Qyburn felt confident that he was approaching the truth about Aerys Targaryen's transformation. The evidence pointed toward a clear narrative that resolved many of the inconsistencies he had discovered in his research. The mysterious advisor from the Free Cities, the gradual changes in the king's behavior, the orchestrated nature of the Duskendale incident, all of it suggested a carefully planned manipulation carried out by someone with extraordinary knowledge and patience. For several days after leaving the Sept of Remembrance, Qyburn walked the streets of King's Landing with the satisfaction of a scholar who believes he has solved a complex puzzle. The Order of the Dragon's Eye, he concluded, was most likely a sophisticated criminal organization that had identified Aerys as a vulnerable target and gradually gained influence over him through a combination of drugs, psychological manipulation, and the strategic use of information gathered through an extensive spy network. This theory explained everything in a way that remained within the bounds of rational possibility. The advisor's apparent knowledge of future events could be attributed to careful intelligence gathering and political analysis. The king's enhanced abilities were simply the result of having access to better information than his rivals. The ritualistic elements described by Morgwinna were theatrical devices designed to enhance the advisor's credibility and maintain psychological control over his royal victim. Even the dragon glass mirror and the prophetic visions could be explained through mundane means. Polished volcanic glass had long been used in various forms of divination and fortune-telling, relying more on the skill of the practitioner in reading subtle cues and making educated guesses than on any supernatural properties. The ancient symbols and forgotten languages were likely elements of an elaborate fraud designed to impress an educated but ultimately naive king who had been raised on legends of Valyrian magical supremacy. Qyburn spent hours in the Red Keep's library, officially researching genealogical records, but actually looking for evidence to support his theory. He found references to similar cases throughout Westerosi history, instances where clever advisors had gained inappropriate influence over their rulers through the strategic use of mystery and manipulation. The most famous example was perhaps the case of King Balor the Blessed, whose extreme religious devotion had been encouraged by a series of septons who benefited greatly from royal patronage of their particular interpretations of the faith. The pattern seemed clear and familiar. Throughout history, intelligent but unscrupulous individuals had recognized that kings, despite their power, were often isolated and vulnerable to psychological manipulation. By presenting themselves as possessors of secret knowledge or special abilities, these advisors could gradually assume effective control over royal decision-making while allowing the king to believe he remained in command. This explanation had the virtue of requiring no belief in supernatural forces or ancient conspiracies. It fit comfortably within the established understanding of political intrigue and human psychology. Most importantly, it provided a satisfying resolution to the mysteries that had initially drawn Qyburn into his investigation. Aerys Targaryen was neither mad nor prophetic, but rather the victim of an elaborate confidence scheme carried out by someone with exceptional skill in manipulation and deception. But even as Qyburn convinced himself that he had solved the puzzle, subtle doubts began to gnaw at the edges of his certainty. The dragon glass artifact given to him by Septa Morgwina continued to display properties that seemed difficult to explain through purely rational means. When he looked into its polished surface in the quiet hours before dawn, he sometimes glimpsed images that bore no relation to his own memories or experiences. Faces he had never seen, places he had never visited, events that seemed to belong to entirely different periods of history. More troubling were the reactions he observed in others when he mentioned his research. Servants in the Red Keep who had worked there during Aerys's reign would suddenly find urgent tasks elsewhere when he attempted to question them about their memories of that period. Maesters who had initially seemed helpful became evasive when he pressed for details about specific events. Even casual conversations about Targaryen history would often end abruptly when he introduced certain topics or names. The breakthrough that shattered his comfortable theory came from an unexpected source. While examining records in the royal archives, Qyburn discovered a cache of documents that had been sealed since Robert's rebellion and forgotten in the chaos of the new regime's establishment. These papers included detailed correspondence between various lords during the final years of Aerys's reign, letters that had been intercepted by royal agents but never acted upon due to the rapid pace of subsequent events. Among these intercepted letters was a series of communications between Lord Tywin Lannister and several other major nobles, discussing their growing concerns about the king's behavior and their plans for responding to what they perceived as increasing royal instability. But the letters revealed something that completely undermined Qyburn's theory about manipulation and deception. Tywin's correspondence showed that he had conducted his own investigation into the mysterious advisor who had gained such influence over Aerys. The Hand of the King had employed his own network of spies and informants to discover the true identity and background of this figure, using resources that far exceeded anything available to a simple criminal organization. The results of this investigation, detailed in a private letter to Lord Rickard Stark, painted a picture that defied rational explanation. The advisor had no traceable history prior to his arrival at court. No records of his birth, education, or previous employment existed in any of the free cities or the known world beyond. More disturbing still, servants who had worked in his chambers reported finding books written in languages that no living scholar could read, artifacts that seemed to be far older than anything that should have survived from before the doom of Valyria, and maps that showed geographical features of Westeros with an accuracy that could only have been achieved through centuries of careful observation. Most significantly, Tywin's agents had discovered that the advisor possessed knowledge that could not have been obtained through any conceivable intelligence network. He knew details about private conversations that had occurred in sealed chambers, understood the contents of letters that had never been sent, and demonstrated familiarity with family secrets that had been guarded for generations. His predictions about future events proved accurate, with a consistency that went far beyond what could be achieved through educated guesswork or political analysis. Lord Tywin, despite his reputation for ruthless pragmatism, had been forced to conclude that supernatural forces were at work in the Red Keep. His final letter on the subject, written shortly before his resignation as Hand, expressed genuine fear about the implications of what he had discovered. The advisor was not merely a skilled manipulator, but something far more dangerous, a representative of powers that had survived from the ancient world and were now moving to influence the course of human events. This revelation sent shockwaves through Qyburn's understanding of the situation. If Tywin Lannister one of the most intelligent and well-informed men in Westeros, had been unable to find rational explanations for the advisor's abilities, then the supernatural hypothesis could not be dismissed as easily as Qyburn had initially believed. The Order of the Dragon's Eye was not a criminal organization, but something far older and more powerful, a genuine conspiracy rooted in the magical traditions of old Valyria. The implications extended far beyond the question of Aerys's transformation. If ancient powers were indeed at work in Westeros, if the Targaryen kings had been guided by forces that possessed genuine prophetic abilities, then the entire accepted narrative of recent history needed to be reconsidered. Robert's rebellion might not have been a spontaneous uprising against royal tyranny, but part of a larger plan orchestrated by entities whose goals and methods remained hidden from ordinary understanding. Qyburn's comfortable theory about manipulation and deception crumbled like a castle built on sand as he absorbed the full implications of what he had discovered. The mystery he was investigating was not a simple case of political intrigue, but something far more complex and dangerous. The supernatural elements he had dismissed as theatrical effects were genuine manifestations of powers that had shaped the course of Westerosi history for centuries. But even as his old theory collapsed, a new and more disturbing possibility began to take shape in his mind. If the Order of the Dragon's Eye possessed genuine magical abilities, if they had been guiding Targaryen kings through supernatural means, then their influence might extend far beyond the reign of Aerys. The patterns he had observed in the behavior of other kings, the architectural anomalies in the Red Keep, the strategic positioning of seemingly random events, all of it might be part of a vast conspiracy that had been operating since the conquest itself. Septa Morgana had warned him that the truth about Aerys was more complex than he imagined, but she had not prepared him for the possibility that the complexity extended across centuries and involved powers that defied rational comprehension. The dragon glass artifact she had given him was not merely a memento of a dead king's delusions, but a genuine magical device that provided glimpses into realms of knowledge that mortal minds were not meant to comprehend. As night fell over King's Landing, and Qyburn sat alone in his chambers pondering the wreckage of his theories, he realized that his investigation had only begun to scratch the surface of the mystery surrounding Aerys Targaryen. The comfortable explanations of political manipulation and psychological control were inadequate to account for the evidence he had uncovered. Something far stranger and more dangerous was at work in the Seven Kingdoms, and he was only beginning to understand the true scope of the forces that had shaped its history. The Order of the Dragon's Eye was real. Their powers were genuine, and their plans extended far beyond the manipulation of a single king. Whatever they were preparing for, whatever threat they believed justified their centuries of secret influence, it was significant enough to require the sacrifice of kings and the orchestration of rebellions. The Game of Thrones was not merely about political power, but about preparing the realm for conflicts that ordinary men could not even imagine. Qyburn stared into the dragon glass mirror as shadows lengthened around him, and for a moment he thought he glimpsed something that made his blood run cold. Figures moving in darkness beyond the wall, eyes that burned with cold fire, and marching behind them, an army of the dead that stretched beyond the horizon. The vision lasted only an instant before the glass returned to its normal reflective state, but the image burned itself into his memory with terrifying clarity. The comfortable world of academic theory and political intrigue had given way to something far more primal and frightening. Forces were at work in Westeros that predated human civilization, and the Order of the Dragon's Eye had been preparing for their return for centuries. Aerys Targaryen was not a victim of manipulation, but a willing participant in preparations for a war that most people believed belonged only to legend and nightmare. As Qyburn extinguished his candles and prepared for what he knew would be a sleepless night, he understood that his investigation had reached a turning point. The rational explanations he had sought were inadequate to explain the evidence he had uncovered. The truth about the Mad King lay not in the familiar realm of political conspiracy, but in the shadowy intersection between the mortal world and powers that had survived from the dawn of time. The Game of Thrones was about to reveal stakes far higher than anyone had imagined, and Qyburn found himself wondering whether the realm was prepared for what was coming. The Order of the Dragon's Eye clearly believed that drastic measures were necessary, that the sacrifice of kings and the orchestration of wars were justified by the magnitude of the threat they faced. Whether they were right or wrong, their actions had shaped the course of history for 3 centuries, and understanding their true purpose had become more urgent than ever. The mystery of Aerys's madness was beginning to reveal itself as part of a much larger and more dangerous puzzle, one that would require all of Qyburn's courage and intelligence to solve. The comfortable certainties of his scholarly life were gone forever, replaced by questions that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world and his place in it. The revelation that supernatural forces were genuinely at work in the transformation of Aerys Targaryen changed everything about Qyburn's investigation. No longer could he approach this mystery as a simple matter of historical research or political analysis. The dragon glass mirror's terrifying visions had opened his eyes to possibilities that challenged the very foundations of his understanding about the world and the forces that shaped it. 3 days after his comfortable theories had crumbled under the weight of Tywin Lannister's private correspondence, Qyburn made the decision that would define the remainder of his quest for truth. He would travel to Dragonstone itself, the ancient seat of Targaryen power, where the family had first established themselves after fleeing the doom of Valyria. If the Order of the Dragon's Eye truly possessed connections to the Dragon Lords of old, if their influence stretched back through centuries of careful manipulation, then the fortress built on that volcanic island would surely contain evidence of their activities. The journey across Blackwater Bay, aboard a merchant vessel, gave Qyburn time to study the documents he had gathered and to prepare himself mentally for what he might discover. The architectural plans he had found in the Citadel's restricted archives showed that Dragonstone contained far more than the obvious chambers and towers visible to casual observers. Beneath the ancient fortress lay a network of natural caves and constructed chambers that had been expanded and modified over the centuries, creating spaces where activities could be conducted in complete secrecy. More intriguingly, the plans showed connections between these hidden areas and natural formations in the volcanic rock that seemed to amplify certain types of magical activity. The positioning of chambers, the angles of passages, the placement of ventilation systems, all of it followed principles that had nothing to do with defensive architecture and everything to do with creating optimal conditions for practices that the Meisters officially condemned as superstition. As Dragonstone's distinctive silhouette rose from the morning mist ahead of their ship, Qyburn felt a mixture of anticipation and trepidation that reminded him of his first explorations in the Citadel's forbidden archives. The fortress seemed to crouch on its rocky perch like some great dragon made of stone, its towers and walls carved to resemble the creatures that had once given House Targaryen dominion over half the known world. But now he could see details that had escaped his notice during previous visits, architectural elements that suggested purposes beyond mere symbolism or intimidation. The current Lord of Dragonstone, a distant Targaryen cousin who had survived Robert's rebellion by demonstrating complete loyalty to the new regime, received Qyburn with the cautious courtesy typically shown to maesters engaged in historical research. Lord Monterys had spent the years since the rebellion trying to distance himself from his family's more controversial legacy, and he seemed genuinely eager to cooperate with any scholarly endeavor that might help rehabilitate the Targaryen name. The castle contains many chambers that have been sealed since before my time, Monterys explained as he led Qyburn through the main keep. My grandfather spoke of rooms beneath the fortress that were considered too dangerous for casual exploration, but I've always assumed such warnings were simply family superstitions designed to keep children from wandering into structurally unsound areas. Qyburn nodded politely while privately noting that the Lord's casual dismissal of family warning suggested he had no understanding of what his ancestors had actually been involved in. This ignorance would work to the Maester's advantage, providing him with relatively unrestricted access to areas that might otherwise have been carefully guarded. The first breakthrough came when Qyburn discovered that his key to the Citadel's restricted archives also opened certain doors within Dragonstone itself. The locks were different in design, and clearly much older, but they had been crafted by the same hands or according to the same principles. This connection suggested a level of coordination between the Order of the Dragon's Eye and the Meisters that went far beyond anything he had previously suspected. Behind the first door lay a chamber that had clearly been used for purposes that had nothing to do with the normal functions of a noble household. The walls were covered with carvings that depicted dragons engaged in activities that seemed more ritualistic than martial. Symbols he recognized from the ancient texts filled the spaces between the larger images, creating patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Most significantly, the chamber contained furniture and implements that could only have been designed for magical practices. Stone tables carved with channels for directing the flow of liquids, braziers positioned according to mathematical principles that maximized the distribution of heat and light. Mirrors of dragon glass mounted at angles that created complex patterns of reflection. Everything in the chamber spoke of careful preparation for activities that required precise attention to environmental conditions and the manipulation of forces that ordinary people could not perceive. But it was the discovery of the library that truly opened Qyburn's eyes to the scope of what he was investigating. Hidden behind a wall that appeared solid but swung aside when the correct sequence of stones was pressed, the library contained hundreds of volumes that should not have existed. Books written in High Valyrian that described magical practices in detail, chronicles of events that had occurred centuries before they were supposedly recorded, and most disturbing of all, prophecies that had been written down long before the events they described had come to pass. Among these volumes, Qyburn found the complete records of the Order of the Dragon's Eye, documents that traced their activities back to the final days of the Valyrian freehold itself. The organization had been founded by dragon lords who possessed genuine prophetic abilities, individuals who had foreseen the doom that would destroy their civilization and had taken steps to preserve essential knowledge for future generations. The Order's original purpose had been simple preservation, maintaining libraries and training centers where the magical arts could continue to be practiced even after the cataclysm that would end the Age of Dragons. But as their prophetic abilities revealed larger patterns in the flow of time, their mission had evolved into something far more ambitious. They had begun to see themselves not merely as preservers of knowledge, but as guardians responsible for guiding human civilization through crises that spanned centuries. The Targaryen conquest of Westeros had not been a spontaneous decision by ambitious dragon lords seeking new territories to rule. It had been carefully planned and orchestrated by the Order as part of a larger strategy for positioning the right bloodlines in the right locations to respond to threats that would not manifest for centuries. Aegon the Conqueror had been as much a servant of the Order's agenda as Aerys would be 300 years later. The chronicles revealed that every major crisis in Targaryen history had been anticipated and planned for generations in advance. The Dance of Dragons had been allowed to occur because it served the Order's purposes, eliminating dragon bloodlines that lacked the necessary prophetic abilities while strengthening those that possessed them. The Blackfire rebellions had been managed to ensure that legitimate Targaryen rule continued while testing the loyalty of various noble houses. Even the reign of Aerys the Mad had been preparing the realm for challenges that were only now beginning to manifest. As Qyburn absorbed the implications of what he was reading, he began to understand that the Order of the Dragon's Eye was not merely a secret society, but something approaching a shadow government that had been operating parallel to official political structures for centuries. Their influence extended into every major institution in Westeros, from the Citadel to the Faith to the great noble houses themselves. They had agents in positions of authority throughout the realm, individuals who might not even realize they were serving the Order's agenda, but whose actions consistently supported their long-term objectives. The most disturbing revelation came when Qyburn discovered records showing that the Order had been preparing for the return of supernatural threats that most people believed belonged only to legend. The others, the ancient enemies of humanity who had been defeated during the Long Night thousands of years ago, were not extinct but merely dormant. The wall that protected the northern border of the Seven Kingdoms was not just a barrier against wildling raids, but a magical construct designed to contain forces that were gradually growing stronger. The Order's prophetic abilities had revealed that the others would eventually return, bringing with them an army of the dead that would threaten all human life in Westeros. This return was not scheduled according to human timelines, but followed patterns that connected to cosmic cycles beyond mortal comprehension. The signs were already beginning to appear: unusual weather patterns, strange behavior among animals, and reports from beyond the wall of phenomena that defied natural explanation. Aerys' transformation into the Mad King had been part of the Order's preparation for this return. His enhanced prophetic abilities had allowed him to see specific details about the coming threat, information that had guided his seemingly irrational decisions about defensive preparations and strategic positioning. The wildfire caches he had ordered constructed throughout King's Landing were not the paranoid preparations of a deranged ruler, but carefully planned weapons designed to counter specific supernatural abilities possessed by the others and their servants. The ritualistic enhancement of Aerys' prophetic gifts had required tremendous sacrifice, not just from the king himself, but from everyone around him. The gradual deterioration of his sanity had been the inevitable price of accessing levels of prophetic sight that human minds were not designed to contain. The Order had known this would happen, had planned for it, and had considered the cost acceptable given the magnitude of the threat they were preparing to face. But there had been complications that the Order had not anticipated. Aerys' enhanced abilities had made him aware of treacheries and betrayals that were still in the planning stages, causing him to react to threats that others could not yet perceive. His increasingly erratic behavior had alienated allies who might have been useful in the coming conflict, while his obsession with fire and burning had created fear and resentment that ultimately led to his overthrow. The record showed that Robert's rebellion had been a catastrophic setback for the Order's plans, destroying years of careful preparation and scattering key bloodlines that would be needed for the final confrontation with the others. The new regime's hostility toward anything associated with Targaryen rule had made it impossible to continue the preparations openly, forcing the Order to work through even more indirect and subtle methods. As Qyburn continued his exploration of Dragonstone's hidden chambers, he began to discover evidence that the Order's activities had not ended with Aerys' death. Recent additions to the library included reports from agents throughout Westeros, detailing ongoing preparations for the supernatural conflict that could no longer be postponed. The signs were multiplying: strange phenomena beyond the wall, unusual behavior among the ravens that carried messages throughout the realm, and disturbing changes in the patterns of magic that the few remaining practitioners could still perceive. Most significantly, the Order had not abandoned their interest in the Targaryen bloodline. Reports indicated that they were closely monitoring the surviving members of the royal family, particularly Daenerys Targaryen, who had recently acquired 3 dragon eggs in the Free Cities. The dragons were not merely symbols of Targaryen power, but living weapons specifically bred and trained to fight supernatural enemies. Their return to the world was a necessary component of the Order's strategy for the coming war. The peaceful hours Qyburn spent reading in the hidden library, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge and planning, gradually gave way to a growing sense of urgency as he realized the implications of what he was discovering. The supernatural threat that had justified the Order's manipulations for so long was no longer a distant possibility, but an immediate reality. The time for subtle influence and careful preparation was coming to an end, and the realm would soon be forced to confront enemies that most of its people believed existed only in children's stories. The Order of the Dragon's Eye had spent centuries preparing for this moment, sacrificing kings and orchestrating rebellions in service of a greater purpose that transcended normal political considerations. Whether their methods had been justified remained a matter for philosophical debate, but their necessity was becoming increasingly clear as the signs of supernatural awakening multiplied throughout the Seven Kingdoms. As sunset painted the volcanic rocks of Dragonstone in shades of fire and blood, Qyburn realized that his investigation had revealed far more than the truth about one king's apparent madness. He had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the very foundations of Westerosi civilization, a shadow government that had been guiding the realm's development for 3 centuries in preparation for a war that was about to begin. The comfortable certainties of his scholarly life were gone forever, replaced by knowledge that carried responsibilities he had never imagined. The Order of the Dragon's Eye was still operating, still preparing, and they would undoubtedly be interested in anyone who had discovered their secrets. Qyburn found himself wondering whether his investigation had made him a valuable asset or a dangerous liability in their continuing efforts to prepare Westeros for the return of its most ancient enemies. The discovery of the Order of the Dragon's Eye's complete historical records fundamentally changed Qyburn's understanding of Westerosi history, but it was what he found in the deepest chambers of Dragonstone that truly revealed the scope of the conspiracy he had uncovered. Beyond the library, hidden behind layers of security that had protected their secrets for centuries, lay the operational center of an organization that had been actively managing the affairs of the Seven Kingdoms since before the conquest itself. The chamber was vast, carved directly from the volcanic rock of the island, and illuminated by braziers that burned with flames of unusual colors. The walls were covered with maps that showed not just the current political boundaries of Westeros, but also the locations of magical sites, the movements of supernatural forces, and the positioning of agents throughout the realm. Most remarkably, these maps were constantly updated, with new information being added by hands that clearly had access to intelligence networks that spanned the known world. At the center of the chamber stood a table made from a single piece of dragon glass, its surface polished to mirror smoothness and inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change as Qyburn observed them. Around this table were arranged chairs that showed signs of recent use, suggesting that the Order's leadership still met regularly to coordinate their activities. Documents scattered across the table's surface included reports from agents in King's Landing, updates on the situation beyond the Wall, and most disturbing of all, detailed analyses of the current political situation that showed knowledge of events that had occurred within the past few days. Qyburn realized with growing excitement and fear that he had stumbled upon a meeting place that was still actively used by the Order's leadership. The organization had not disbanded after Aerys' death, but had simply adapted their methods to operate under the new regime. Their influence continued to shape events throughout Westeros, though their activities were now more carefully concealed than they had been during the height of Targaryen power. The documents on the table revealed the true scope of what the Order had accomplished during Aerys' reign, and what they were still working to achieve. The king's apparent madness had been a carefully orchestrated performance designed to prepare the realm for supernatural threats while providing cover for activities that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. His enhanced prophetic abilities had allowed him to see specific details about the coming conflict with the others, information that had guided strategic decisions whose importance would not become apparent for years. But the most significant revelation was contained in a leather portfolio marked with the personal seal of the Order's current leadership. Inside, Qyburn found detailed records of the rituals that had been performed to enhance Aerys' prophetic abilities, complete documentation of the magical practices that had been used to transform a normal king into something approaching a supernatural oracle, The process had been far more complex and dangerous than he had imagined, requiring not just the willing participation of the subject but also the sacrifice of others whose blood and life force had been used to fuel the transformations. The enhancement rituals had begun shortly after Aerys's coronation, initially manifesting as unusually vivid dreams that gradually developed into genuine prophetic visions. The process had required regular exposure to dragon glass mirrors that had been specially prepared with blood magic, substances that enhanced the subject's natural magical abilities, and participation in ceremonies that connected the king's consciousness to cosmic forces that transcended normal human understanding. Each session had strengthened Aerys's prophetic sight, while simultaneously eroding his sanity, creating the paradox that would define his reign. The clearer his visions of the future became, the less capable he was of functioning normally in the present. The Order had known this would happen, had planned for it, and had considered the sacrifice necessary, given the information that only enhanced prophetic abilities could provide. The record showed that Aerys had not been the first Targaryen king to undergo such enhancement. Similar rituals had been performed on other rulers throughout the dynasty's history, though with varying degrees of success, and always with the same inevitable cost. King Bala the Blessed had been an early experiment in prophetic enhancement, his extreme religious devotion masking the systematic erosion of his sanity as he gained increasingly clear visions of supernatural threats. King Malagor the Cruel had undergone a different type of enhancement, one that had increased his capacity for violence and strategic thinking at the cost of his ability to form normal human relationships. The pattern extended back to the conquest itself, revealing that Aegon the Conqueror had possessed genuine prophetic abilities that had guided his strategic decisions. His seemingly impossible victories against overwhelming odds had been the result of supernatural foresight rather than mere military genius. The 3 dragons he had brought to Westeros had not been randomly selected, but had been specifically chosen for their abilities to counter supernatural threats that Aegon had seen in his visions of the future. But the most disturbing revelation was the discovery that these enhancement rituals had not been limited to Targaryen kings. The Order had been systematically identifying and developing individuals with latent prophetic abilities throughout the realm, creating a network of enhanced agents who could perceive supernatural threats that remained invisible to ordinary observers. These individuals had been placed in positions of authority throughout Westerosi society, where they could influence events while appearing to act according to normal political and personal motivations. Lord Tywin Lannister's investigation into the mysterious advisor who had influenced Aerys had been more successful than Qyburn had initially realized. The documents revealed that Tywin had not only identified the advisor as an agent of the Order, but had also discovered the existence of similar agents throughout the realm. His resignation as Hand of the King had not been motivated by frustration with royal policy, but by his growing awareness that forces beyond his control were manipulating events on a scale that made normal political maneuvering irrelevant. The advisor himself, the figure known as the Flame Prophet, was revealed to be far more than a simple agent of the Order. He was one of the original founders of the organization, a Valyrian dragon lord who had survived the Doom through magical means and had spent the intervening centuries working to prepare the world for the return of the others. His apparent youth was the result of blood magic that had extended his natural lifespan far beyond normal human limits, allowing him to oversee preparations that spanned multiple generations. The Flame Prophet's true identity was documented in records that traced his activities back to the final days of the Valyrian freehold. He had been among the Dragon Lords who had possessed the most advanced prophetic abilities, individuals who had seen not just the immediate catastrophe that would destroy their civilization, but also the larger patterns that would shape the future of human civilization. His preparations for the Doom had included not just the preservation of knowledge and resources, but also the establishment of organizations that could continue his work across the centuries. The Order of the Dragon's Eye had been created as a tool for managing the transition from the Age of Dragons to whatever would come next. Their original mission had been to preserve the bloodlines and knowledge necessary for humanity to survive the supernatural threats that would inevitably return. But as their understanding of the future had deepened, their role had evolved into something far more active and interventionist. The documents revealed that every major event in Westerosi history since the conquest had been either orchestrated or influenced by the Order to serve their long-term objectives. Robert's rebellion had been a setback in their plans, but they had adapted quickly to work with the new political reality. The death of Aerys had been regrettable, but not entirely unexpected, and contingency plans had already been developed for continuing their preparations under different circumstances. Most significantly, the Order had not abandoned their interest in the Targaryen bloodline. Detailed reports showed that they were closely monitoring Daenerys Targaryen's activities in the Free Cities, waiting for the right moment to make contact and guide her development. Her dragons were not just symbols of returning Targaryen power, but living weapons that had been specifically bred to fight supernatural enemies. The Order's agents had been instrumental in ensuring that she acquired the dragon eggs, just as they had been involved in countless other seemingly coincidental events that had shaped her journey. The revelation that stunned Qyburn most profoundly was the discovery that the Order's preparations were entering their final phase. The signs that had been accumulating for years were now accelerating, indicating that the return of the others was imminent rather than merely inevitable. The strange phenomena beyond the wall, the unusual weather patterns, the disturbing reports from Night's Watch Rangers, all of it pointed to a supernatural awakening that could no longer be ignored or postponed. The Order's enhanced agents throughout the realm were being activated, their long period of careful observation and subtle influence giving way to more direct action. The political chaos that had followed Robert's death was not merely the result of competing claims to the throne, but part of a larger pattern of preparation for the supernatural conflict that was about to begin. The War of the Five Kings was serving the Order's purposes by weakening the established power structures that might interfere with their emergency preparations. As Qyburn absorbed the full implications of what he was reading, he began to understand that he had stumbled upon information that made him one of the most dangerous men in Westeros. The knowledge he now possessed could reshape the political landscape of the realm, but it could also make him a target for forces that had been eliminating threats to their security for centuries. The Order of the Dragon's Eye had not survived for so long by allowing their secrets to be exposed, and they would undoubtedly take action to protect their carefully constructed conspiracy. The sound of footsteps echoing through the chamber's entrance warned him that his time alone with the Order's secrets was coming to an end. As he quickly gathered the most important documents and prepared to leave the hidden chamber, Qyburn realized that his investigation had reached a critical turning point. He now possessed knowledge that could change the course of history, but he also faced choices that would determine whether he lived to use that knowledge or became another casualty in the Order's long war against the supernatural forces that threatened human civilization. The truth about Aerys Targaryen's madness was far more complex and significant than he had ever imagined. The Mad King had not been a victim of mental illness or political manipulation, but a willing participant in preparations for a war that would determine the fate of all human life in Westeros. His apparent insanity had been the price he had paid for the prophetic abilities necessary to guide the realm through the crisis that was now beginning to unfold. The Order of the Dragon's Eye had orchestrated events for centuries, sacrificing kings and manipulating conflicts in service of a purpose that transcended normal political considerations. Their methods had been ruthless and their secrecy absolute, but their ultimate goal was the survival of human civilization itself. Whether their approach had been justified remained a matter for debate, but their necessity was becoming increasingly clear as the supernatural threat they had been preparing to face finally began to manifest. As Qyburn made his way back through the hidden passages of Dragonstone, carrying with him knowledge that would reshape his understanding of everything he thought he knew about the world, he wondered whether the realm was ready for what was coming. The Order had spent centuries preparing for this moment, but their preparations had been disrupted by events they had not anticipated. The coming conflict would test not just their planning and resources, but also their ability to adapt to circumstances that even their enhanced prophetic abilities had not fully foreseen. The Game of Thrones was about to reveal its true stakes, and Qyburn found himself wondering whether anyone would survive to see how it ended. The footsteps that had interrupted Qyburn's exploration of the Order's secret chamber belonged not to guards or servants, but to figures whose presence on Dragonstone revealed the true scope of the conspiracy he had uncovered. 3 individuals emerged from the shadows of the ancient fortress, their movements coordinated with the precision of people who had worked together for decades. As they approached through the volcanic corridors, Qyburn realized that his discovery of the Order's secrets had not gone unnoticed, and that his investigation was about to enter a phase that would test everything he thought he understood about the world. The first figure to step into the light was a woman of indeterminate age, her silver hair marking her as one of the old Valyrian bloodlines, but her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences spanning far more years than her physical appearance suggested. She wore robes that seemed to shift color in the flickering torchlight, and at her throat hung a pendant that incorporated dragonglass and precious metals in patterns that hurt to look at directly. When she spoke, her voice carried accents that belonged to no living language, yet Qyburn understood every word with perfect clarity. "Maester Qyburn," she said, her tone neither threatening nor welcoming, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You have shown remarkable dedication in pursuing knowledge that lesser minds would have dismissed as impossible. The Order of the Dragon's Eye has been observing your progress with considerable interest." The second figure was clearly the Flame Prophet himself, the mysterious advisor whose influence over Aerys had been documented in so many of the records Qyburn had studied. In person, he appeared to be a man in his middle years, tall and lean with the aristocratic bearing of old Valyrian nobility. But there was something about his presence that suggested vast age and accumulated wisdom, as if he had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations and drawn lessons that ordinary mortals could never comprehend. His eyes burned with an inner fire that seemed to pierce through surface appearances to examine the very essence of whatever he observed. The third member of the group was perhaps the most disturbing, for Qyburn recognized him as someone who should have been dead for nearly 20 years. Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, the White Bull, who had supposedly died at the Tower of Joy during Robert's rebellion, stood before him with the same commanding presence that had made him legendary among the knights of Westeros. His white cloak was unmarked by time or battle, and his face showed no signs of the years that should have aged him since his supposed death. "The questions you have been asking," Hightower said, his voice carrying the same authority that had once commanded the Kingsguard, "have brought you to the attention of forces that have been shaping the destiny of this realm for far longer than most people can imagine. Your discovery of our records was not accidental, nor was your ability to decode the information they contained. You have been guided to this moment by powers that recognized your potential value to our cause." The woman stepped forward, and as she moved, Qyburn noticed that her shadow seemed to move independently of her physical form, creating patterns on the chamber walls that suggested meanings beyond his current understanding. "What you have learned about King Aerys represents only the smallest fragment of the truth we have been preserving. The enhancement of his prophetic abilities was a necessary step in preparing the realm for threats that are now beginning to manifest. But it was part of a much larger pattern of preparation that has been ongoing since before the conquest itself." She gestured toward the maps and documents that covered the chamber's walls, and as she did so, the images seemed to shift and change, revealing layers of information that had been invisible moments before. "Every Targaryen king has served our purposes in some capacity, though few of them understood the true nature of their role. The bloodline carries genetic markers that enhance receptivity to prophetic visions, but the full activation of these abilities requires careful preparation and considerable sacrifice. The flame prophet moved to the great dragon glass table at the chamber's center, and as his hands touched its surface, the inscribed symbols began to glow with soft light that revealed even more complex patterns beneath. Aegon the Conqueror was not driven by mere ambition when he decided to invade Westeros. His prophetic abilities had shown him visions of the threats that would eventually emerge from beyond the wall, and he understood that the Seven Kingdoms needed to be united under strong leadership that could respond to supernatural dangers. His conquest was the first step in a preparation process that has continued for 3 centuries. The revelation that every Targaryen king had been part of the Order's long-term strategy forced Qyburn to reconsider everything he thought he understood about Westerosi history: the Dance of Dragons, the Blackfire Rebellions, the reign of Aerys the Mad. All of it had been orchestrated or influenced to serve purposes that transcended normal political considerations. The royal family had not simply ruled the Seven Kingdoms, but had served as guardians, preparing the realm for conflicts that most people believed belonged only to legend. The process of enhancing prophetic abilities, the woman continued, requires not just the willing participation of the subject, but also the creation of specific environmental conditions that can amplify natural magical talents. The construction of the Red Keep included chambers designed for this purpose, spaces where the barriers between the physical world and the realm of prophetic sight could be temporarily weakened. Similar facilities were built at Dragonstone, Summer Hall, and other locations throughout the realm. Lord Commander Hightower approached one of the chamber's walls, where a detailed map showed the locations of these hidden facilities throughout Westeros. The network we established allowed for the training and development of individuals with latent prophetic abilities, creating a resource that could be called upon when circumstances required enhanced insight into future events. King Aerys was the culmination of this program, possessing the strongest natural abilities we had encountered in generations of careful breeding and selection. The map revealed the true scope of the Order's influence throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Hidden chambers existed beneath major castles, training facilities were concealed in remote locations, and safe houses provided secure meeting places for agents who coordinated activities across vast distances. The network was so extensive and well concealed that it could operate parallel to official political structures without detection, influencing events while remaining invisible to those it manipulated. The enhancement process used on Aerys, the Flame Prophet explained, his voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting technical procedures, involved regular exposure to specially prepared dragon glass that had been infused with the blood of individuals possessing strong prophetic abilities. The glass served as a focusing medium that allowed his consciousness to access levels of temporal perception normally beyond human capability. Each session strengthened his prophetic sight, but also accelerated the deterioration of his ability to function normally in present circumstances. The woman produced a small vial filled with liquid that seemed to contain its own light, swirling with colors that had no names in any human language. The enhancement required chemical preparations derived from sources that no longer exist in the known world. Substances that survived the doom of Valyria, preserved in our hidden repositories for use when circumstances demanded their application. The supply is finite, and we have been extremely selective about when and how these materials are used. Qyburn stared at the vial, understanding that he was looking at something that represented the accumulated magical knowledge of a civilization that had been destroyed centuries ago. The Order had not simply preserved books and artifacts from old Valyria, but had maintained the actual capability to perform magical practices that the rest of the world believed were lost forever. Aerys volunteered for the enhancement process. Hightower continued, his expression grave with the memory of conversations that had taken place decades ago. He understood the price he would pay and accepted it willingly when we explained the nature of the threats he would need to perceive. His apparent madness was a performance designed to provide cover for the activities necessary to prepare the realm, but it was also the genuine result of accessing levels of prophetic sight that human minds are not designed to contain. The revelation that Aerys had been a willing participant in his own transformation rather than a victim of manipulation changed everything about how Qyburn understood the king's reign. The Mad King had not been driven insane by trauma or supernatural influence, but had deliberately sacrificed his sanity to gain the prophetic abilities necessary to guide the realm through the crisis that was now beginning to unfold. The specific threats he perceived, the woman said, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to carry across vast distances, involved the return of the others, the ancient enemies of humanity who had been defeated during the long night, but never truly destroyed. His visions showed him details about their capabilities, their strategies, and the timeline of their return that allowed us to make preparations that would otherwise have been impossible. She gestured toward a section of the chamber where detailed drawings showed creatures that seemed to be composed of ice and shadow, their forms only partially visible even in the artistic representations. The others possess abilities that transcend normal physical limitations. They can raise the dead to serve as soldiers in their armies. They can manipulate weather patterns to create conditions favorable to their advance, and they command magical powers that can neutralize many of the defensive advantages that human civilization has developed over the centuries. The Flame Prophet approached these drawings, and as he studied them, his expression revealed a mixture of fear and determination that spoke of knowledge gained through centuries of preparation. Conventional military strategies are inadequate against such enemies. The others cannot be defeated through normal warfare, negotiated with through diplomacy, or contained through traditional defensive measures. They represent an existential threat to all human life in Westeros, and countering them requires approaches that most people would consider impossible or insane. The dragon glass table began to display images that seemed to move and change, like living memories, showing scenes from the original Long Night, thousands of years ago. Qyburn watched in fascination and horror as the images revealed the true scope of the ancient conflict. Battles fought not just with swords and spears, but with magical forces that could reshape the very landscape. The heroes of that bygone age had not achieved victory through conventional means, but had employed techniques that required tremendous sacrifice and the willing cooperation of powers that existed beyond normal human understanding. The preparations Aerys made during his reign, Hightower explained, were based on his enhanced understanding of what would be required to face such enemies again. The wildfire caches positioned throughout King's Landing were not random defensive measures, but carefully planned weapons designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities that the others possess. Fire magic, when properly prepared and deployed, can neutralize their ability to raise and control the dead. The woman produced another set of documents that showed the strategic positioning of these wildfire caches in relation to the city's layout. The placement followed patterns derived from ancient military manuals that described tactics used during the original Long Night. Each cache was positioned to create overlapping fields of effect that would prevent the others from using King's Landing as a base for raising large numbers of undead servants. The preparations were incomplete when Aerys was killed, but enough had been accomplished to provide significant defensive advantages if properly activated. Qyburn studied the diagrams, beginning to understand that what had appeared to be the paranoid preparations of a mad king were actually sophisticated defensive measures based on knowledge that had been preserved from humanity's previous encounter with supernatural enemies. Aerys had not been preparing to burn his own city out of spite or madness, but had been creating weapons that could save it from a threat that conventional forces could not defeat. The timeline of the others' return, the Flame Prophet continued, has been accelerating beyond what our original calculations had predicted. The signs that Aerys saw in his visions decades ago are now manifesting with increasing frequency and intensity. Strange phenomena beyond the wall, unusual behavior among animals throughout the northern regions, and disturbing changes in the patterns of magic that still function in the world all indicate that the final phase of their awakening has begun. The images on the dragonglass table shifted to show current events, scenes from beyond the wall, where darkness seemed to be spreading like a living thing across the landscape. The Night's Watch has been reporting encounters with creatures that should not exist, finding evidence of activities that suggest organized preparation for large-scale military action. The others are no longer dormant but are actively beginning the process that will culminate in their return to the lands of men. As Qyburn absorbed the implications of what he was seeing and hearing, he began to understand that his investigation into the mystery of Aerys's madness had revealed something far more significant than he had imagined. The Mad King had not been mad at all, but had been the most recent guardian in a chain of protectors that stretched back to the dawn of human civilization in Westeros. His apparent insanity had been the price he had paid for the knowledge necessary to prepare the realm for a war that was about to begin. "The question now," the woman said, her gaze fixed on Qyburn with an intensity that seemed to look directly into his soul, "is whether you are prepared to join us in completing the preparations that Aerys began. The knowledge you have gained makes you too dangerous to simply return to your previous life, but it also makes you potentially valuable to our cause. The choice is yours, but it must be made now, before the final phase of our preparations begins." The weight of the decision settled upon Qyburn's shoulders like a heavy cloak, carrying with it the understanding that his life would never be the same regardless of what he chose. He had sought the truth about one king's transformation and had discovered a conspiracy that reached into the very foundations of human civilization in Westeros. Now he stood at the crossroads between the comfortable ignorance of his former existence and the terrible responsibility of helping to guide the realm through the greatest crisis in its history. The Order of the Dragon's Eye had revealed their secrets to him, because circumstances no longer allowed for the gradual approach they had employed for centuries. The time for subtle influence and careful preparation was ending, and the realm would soon need every advantage it could gain in the struggle against enemies that most people still believed were nothing more than legend. The truth about Aerys Targaryen was just the beginning of revelations that would reshape everything the Seven Kingdoms thought they knew about their place in the world. The decision to join the Order of the Dragon's Eye came to Qyburn not as a sudden revelation, but as the inevitable conclusion of a journey that had begun the moment he first questioned the accepted narrative about Aerys Targaryen. Standing in that ancient chamber beneath Dragonstone, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had shaped the course of human history for centuries, he understood that he had already chosen his path simply by pursuing the truth to its ultimate destination. The comfortable life of a scholar content with surface knowledge was no longer possible for someone who had glimpsed the forces that moved behind the curtain of recorded history. "I accept," he said simply, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was agreeing to undertake. "The realm deserves to know the truth, and if the threats you describe are real, then it deserves protectors who understand what they are facing." The woman whose name he had not yet learned smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since their encounter had begun. "Wisdom often comes through suffering, but it can also come through the courage to accept knowledge that others fear to possess. You will find that serving the Order's cause brings both burdens and rewards that you cannot yet imagine." Lord Commander Hightower stepped forward and placed a hand on Qyburn's shoulder with the same gesture he had once used to welcome new members into the Kingsguard. "The oath you are taking today binds you not to any king or lord, but to the protection of all human life in Westeros. The methods we employ may sometimes appear ruthless or manipulative, but they serve a purpose that transcends normal political considerations. You will be asked to keep secrets that could save the realm or destroy it, depending on how they are used." The Flame Prophet approached the great dragonglass table and began to manipulate the symbols inscribed on its surface, causing new images to appear that showed the current state of the Order's preparations throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Your first task will be to understand the full scope of what we have accomplished and what still remains to be done. The enhancement of Aerys was only one component of a strategy that involves thousands of individuals working toward coordinated objectives across multiple generations. The images revealed a network of agents and allies that extended into every major institution in Westeros, from the highest levels of noble houses to the humblest crafts guilds in market towns. Some of these individuals were fully aware of their role in the Order's plans, while others served unknowingly, their actions guided by suggestions and influences they attributed to their own judgment. The coordination required to manage such a vast conspiracy spoke of organizational abilities that surpassed anything Qyburn had previously encountered. The Citadel itself, the woman explained, has been influenced by our agents for over 2 centuries. Not all Meisters serve our cause, but those in key positions have ensured that certain knowledge is preserved while other information is allowed to be forgotten or dismissed as superstition. The chain you wear marks you as a scholar, but it also identifies you as someone who has access to resources that most people cannot obtain. She gestured toward a section of the chamber where books and scrolls were arranged according to subjects that had no place in official academic curricula. The restricted archives you accessed in Old Town represent only a fraction of the knowledge we have preserved from the ancient world. Complete libraries exist in hidden locations throughout Westeros containing information about magical practices, prophetic techniques, and supernatural threats that the Maesters officially deny. Your training as one of our agents will include access to materials that will revolutionize your understanding of how the world actually functions. The Flame Prophet produced a leather-bound journal whose pages seemed to glow with their own inner light, and as he opened it, symbols appeared that rearranged themselves into readable text as Qyburn observed them. This grimoire contains prophecies that were recorded before the doom of Valyria, visions of future events that span thousands of years and describe patterns that are only now beginning to reach their culmination. Aerys's enhanced abilities allowed him to understand specific details within these larger patterns, information that guided his preparations for the current crisis. As Qyburn studied the prophecies, he began to understand that the return of the others was part of a cyclical pattern that had repeated throughout human history. The supernatural enemies that threatened civilization were not random forces of destruction, but represented one side of a cosmic balance that required periodic resolution through conflict. The Long Night had not been an isolated historical event, but the most recent occurrence of a struggle that reached back to the very origins of human settlement in Westeros. The Azor Ahai prophecy, Hightower said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had studied these materials for decades, describes not a single individual, but a role that must be filled whenever the balance between light and darkness shifts too far toward winter and death. The prince that was promised, the hero who will wield Lightbringer against the darkness, these are not names but descriptions of someone who will emerge when circumstances require their intervention. The dragon glass table displayed images of heroes from various periods of Westerosi history, individuals who had played crucial roles in maintaining the balance between supernatural forces. Some were remembered in songs and legends, while others had worked in secret, their contributions known only to the Order and those who understood the true nature of their struggles. Daenerys Targaryen, the woman said, her tone becoming more urgent as the discussion turned to current events, represents our greatest hope for fielding the hero described in the ancient prophecies. Her bloodline carries the genetic markers necessary for dragon bonding. Her experiences have prepared her for the type of leadership that will be required, and most importantly, she has begun to manifest the prophetic abilities that will allow her to understand the true nature of the threats she will face. The images showed the young Targaryen woman in the Free Cities, accompanied by her 3 dragons whose growth had been carefully monitored by Order agents throughout the known world. The dragons are not merely weapons but living embodiments of the fire magic that represents humanity's most effective defense against the ice magic wielded by the others. Their return to the world was orchestrated through careful manipulation of events spanning decades, ensuring that they would hatch at the precise moment when their capabilities would be most needed. Qyburn studied the images of Daenerys and her dragons, beginning to understand that what appeared to be a young woman's quest to reclaim her family's throne was actually the culmination of centuries of preparation for a conflict that would determine the fate of human civilization. "How long have you been guiding her development?" he asked. "Since before her birth," the Flame Prophet replied. "The marriage of her parents was arranged to ensure that their children would possess the optimal combination of genetic traits necessary for dragon bonding and prophetic sight. Her exile from Westeros was manipulated to place her in locations where she would encounter the experiences necessary to develop her leadership abilities. Even her acquisition of the dragon eggs was coordinated by our agents, though she remains unaware of the extent to which her journey has been guided." The revelation that Daenerys' entire life had been orchestrated by the Order raised troubling questions about free will and manipulation that Qyburn felt compelled to address. "Does she have any choice in the role you've assigned to her? Are you creating a hero or manufacturing a weapon?" The woman's expression became thoughtful as she considered how to respond to his concerns. "The prophecies describe someone who will choose to take on the burdens of heroism rather than being forced into that role. Our manipulations have created opportunities and removed obstacles, but the fundamental decisions about how to respond to those circumstances must come from her own character and judgment. A hero who acts only according to external direction cannot fulfill the requirements described in the ancient texts." Lord Commander Hightower moved to a different section of the chamber where detailed maps showed the current political situation throughout Westeros and the Free Cities. "The chaos that has followed Robert Baratheon's death serves our purposes by weakening the established power structures that might interfere with our emergency preparations. The War of the Five Kings has eliminated or distracted many of the individuals who might have opposed the changes that will be necessary when the supernatural threat becomes undeniable." The maps revealed how the Order had influenced events to ensure that key resources and strategic positions would be available when needed. Certain lords had been encouraged to make alliances that would prove useful in the coming conflict, while others had been maneuvered into positions where their opposition to necessary measures could be neutralized. The apparent randomness of political events concealed patterns of manipulation that served objectives invisible to normal observers. "Jon Snow," the Flame Prophet said, his finger tracing a route on the map that led from Winterfell to the Wall, "represents another crucial element in our preparations. His parentage combines Targaryen blood with the ancient magical heritage of the North, creating abilities that will be essential for coordinating the defense against threats emerging from beyond the Wall. His position with the Night's Watch provides him with first-hand knowledge of the supernatural phenomena that others still refuse to acknowledge." The revelation that Jon Snow was also part of the Order's planning added another layer of complexity to what Qyburn was beginning to understand about their strategy. The convergence of multiple individuals with enhanced abilities at the crucial moment was not coincidental but represented the culmination of careful breeding programs and strategic positioning that had been ongoing for generations. "The three heads of the dragon," the woman said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting ancient prophecy, "represent not just individual heroes, but the coordination of different aspects of the magical heritage that will be required to face the others. Fire and ice, prophecy and action, dragons and direwolves, all of these elements must work together to restore the balance that has been disrupted by the supernatural awakening now taking place." As the discussion continued through the night, Qyburn began to absorb the full scope of the knowledge that had been preserved by the Order across centuries of careful study and preparation. The magical practices that had been dismissed as superstition by the Meisters were revealed to be sophisticated techniques for manipulating forces that existed parallel to the physical world. The prophecies that had been treated as primitive mythology contained detailed information about recurring patterns in the cosmic balance that governed the relationship between civilization and the supernatural threats that periodically emerged to challenge it. The enhancement techniques that had been used on Aerys represented only one application of knowledge that could be employed in many different ways depending on circumstances and objectives. Some individuals could be given enhanced physical abilities that would make them more effective warriors against supernatural enemies. Others could be trained to perceive magical phenomena that remained invisible to normal observers. Still others could be taught to manipulate the environmental conditions that affected the operation of magical forces. The network we have built, Hightower explained, includes not just agents who understand their role in our organization, but also individuals who have been enhanced in various ways to serve specific functions in the coming conflict. Some are positioned within existing military structures where they can influence tactical decisions. Others work within religious organizations where they can prepare the population for accepting explanations that transcend normal understanding. Still others operate in commercial enterprises where they can ensure that necessary resources are available when and where they are needed. The woman produced a series of documents that showed the current status of these preparations throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The timeline has accelerated beyond our original projections, requiring us to implement contingency plans that we had hoped would not be necessary for several more years. The Other's awakening is proceeding faster than even our enhanced prophetic abilities had predicted, forcing us to reveal aspects of our organization that we had planned to keep hidden until the final phase of the conflict. The maps and reports revealed a realm that was far better prepared for supernatural conflict than its official leadership realized. Hidden weapons caches contained materials specifically designed to counter the abilities of undead enemies. Communication networks could relay information faster than traditional methods allowed. Safe houses and fortified positions had been established in locations that would provide strategic advantages against enemies that possessed capabilities beyond normal military experience. Your role in this network, the Flame Prophet said, turning his attention back to Qyburn, will be to serve as a coordinator between different aspects of our organization. Your research abilities and academic credentials provide you with access to information sources that other agents cannot reach. Your understanding of the historical patterns we have been following will allow you to anticipate developments that might catch other observers by surprise. As dawn began to break over Dragonstone, painting the ancient fortress in shades of gold and crimson that seemed appropriate for the revelations that had filled the night, Qyburn understood that his life as a simple scholar seeking academic knowledge was over forever. He had become part of a conspiracy that reached into the very foundations of human civilization, accepting responsibilities that would require him to make decisions that could affect the survival of everyone he had ever known. The truth about Aerys Targaryen's madness had led him to discover truths about the world that were far more significant than the fate of any single king. The Order of the Dragon's Eye had spent centuries preparing for a conflict that was about to test everything they had learned about protecting humanity from threats that existed beyond the normal bounds of political and military consideration. Whether their preparations would prove adequate remained to be seen, but Qyburn was now committed to ensuring that they would have every possible advantage when the final confrontation began. The gathering of ancient wisdom was complete, and the time for action was at hand. The final revelation came not through documents or testimonies, but through a ritual that would forever change Qyburn's understanding of reality itself. As the morning sun climbed higher over Dragonstone, the three members of the Order's leadership led him deeper into the fortress than he had previously imagined possible, through passages that seemed to descend not just into the volcanic rock, but into realms where the normal laws of physics held less sway than they did in the world above. The chamber they eventually reached existed in a space that defied architectural explanation, far larger than the island that contained it should have been able to accommodate. The walls curved upward into shadows that seemed to contain their own depth, and the floor was composed of dragon glass so perfectly polished that it reflected not just the physical forms of those who walked across it, but also images of events that had occurred in other times and places. At the center of this impossible space stood a structure that took Qyburn several moments to comprehend. It appeared to be a throne, but one carved from materials that seemed to incorporate elements from across the known world and beyond. Valyrian steel formed the base and armrests, while the back was constructed from what appeared to be crystallized fire that pulsed with its own inner light. Most remarkably, the seat itself was carved from a single piece of weirwood that had been transformed through processes that left it white as bone, but retaining all the mystical properties associated with the sacred trees of the north. "The throne of prophecy," the woman said, her voice filled with reverence that spoke of centuries of accumulated respect for what the structure represented. Built by the first dragon lords who possessed true prophetic sight, preserved through the doom of Valyria, and transported to Westeros when the Order established its operations in this realm. From this seat, those with sufficient ability can perceive not just possible futures, but the underlying patterns that connect all events across time. The Flame Prophet approached the throne with the careful movements of someone handling something infinitely precious and infinitely dangerous. Aerys sat here on 17 occasions during his reign, each session lasting longer than the previous one as his enhanced abilities grew stronger. The visions he received guided every major decision of his kingship, from the positioning of his wildfire caches to the strategic timing of political maneuvers that would seem random to outside observers. Lord Commander Hightower gestured toward the walls of the chamber, where images began to appear that showed scenes from across the history of Westeros. Every Targaryen king who underwent enhancement used this throne to access levels of prophetic sight that would have been impossible through other means. The construction incorporates materials that resonate with the genetic markers carried by Dragonlord bloodlines, amplifying their natural abilities while providing protection against the psychological damage that uncontrolled prophetic visions can cause. As Qyburn studied the throne more closely, he began to notice details that revealed the true sophistication of its construction. The Valyrian steel components were inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change as he observed them, creating patterns that guided the flow of magical energies through the structure. The crystallized fire in the back of the throne pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, suggesting that it somehow attuned itself to the life force of anyone in its proximity. Most remarkably, the weirwood seat bore carvings that depicted not just the faces traditionally associated with heart trees, but also scenes that showed the interconnection between past, present, and future events. These images moved and changed like living memories, creating a visual representation of the temporal patterns that the throne was designed to reveal to those who possessed the ability to interpret them. "The final truth about Aerys," the woman said, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to carry across vast distances, "can only be understood by experiencing what he experienced. The visions that guided his actions during the final years of his reign, the knowledge that forced him to make choices that appeared to be madness to those who could not see what he saw. We offer you the opportunity to witness these visions yourself, to understand firsthand why the Mad King was willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good of the realm." The offer carried implications that made Qyburn's blood run cold. He understood now why the Order had brought him to this place, why they had revealed their secrets with such apparent openness. They needed him to experience the prophetic visions that had driven Aerys to his apparent madness, to understand viscerally rather than intellectually why the Order's methods were necessary for protecting human civilization from threats that transcended normal understanding. "The process is not without risk," the Flame Prophet warned, his expression grave with the memory of others who had undergone similar experiences. The human mind is not designed to perceive multiple timelines simultaneously, to witness events that exist outside the normal flow of causality. Some who have attempted to use the throne have been driven genuinely mad by visions they could not process or understand. Others have been so traumatized by what they saw that they became incapable of functioning in normal reality. Hightower stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword in a gesture that spoke of his readiness to act if the situation required intervention. But the alternative is to remain ignorant of truths that will soon become undeniable to everyone in Westeros. The supernatural threat that Aerys perceived is no longer a distant possibility, but an immediate reality. Those who understand what is coming will have advantages that could mean the difference between survival and extinction when the final confrontation begins. Qyburn approached the throne slowly, understanding that he was about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. The comfortable certainties of his scholarly existence were already gone, replaced by knowledge that had fundamentally altered his understanding of the world. Now he was being offered the opportunity to experience the same prophetic enhancement that had transformed Aerys from a normal king into something approaching a supernatural oracle. "What exactly will I see?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt as he contemplated the magnitude of what he was considering. "The past, present, and future, as they truly exist," the woman replied. "Not as isolated events, but as part of a continuous pattern that extends across millennia. You will witness the original long night and understand how it ended, see the current preparations of the others, and comprehend their capabilities, and glimpse possible futures that depend upon decisions that have not yet been made. Most importantly, you will understand why Aerys made the choices he did, and why his apparent madness was actually the sanest response possible to the knowledge he possessed." The dragon glass floor beneath the throne began to glow with soft light as the chamber's magical systems responded to the presence of someone with the potential to use them. Symbols appeared on the smooth surface, creating patterns that seemed to guide Qyburn toward the seat, while simultaneously warning him of the dangers associated with what he was about to attempt. As he settled into the throne, feeling the weirwood seat conform to his body, as if it had been carved specifically for him, Qyburn experienced a moment of profound stillness that seemed to extend far beyond the normal passage of time. Then the visions began, overwhelming his consciousness with images and experiences that came too rapidly and too intensely for his normal mental processes to handle. He saw the long night as it had actually occurred, not the sanitized version presented in historical accounts, but the true horror of humanity's near extinction at the hands of supernatural enemies whose capabilities far exceeded anything that legends had preserved. The others had not been defeated through conventional warfare but had been driven back through sacrifices so terrible that the survivors had deliberately forgotten the details, preserving only fragments of the truth in prophecies and songs that subsequent generations had dismissed as mythology. The visions showed him the construction of the wall, revealing it to be not just a barrier of ice and stone, but a magical construct that required constant maintenance through rituals that few people understood. The Night's Watch had originally been not just a military organization, but a magical order trained to maintain the spells that kept the supernatural threat contained. As their knowledge had been lost over the centuries, the wall's protective capabilities had gradually weakened, allowing the others to begin their slow awakening. But it was the visions of the future that truly revealed the scope of the crisis that Aerys had been preparing to face. Qyburn witnessed armies of the dead marching south in numbers that defied comprehension, their ranks swelled by every person who fell before their advance. He saw the wall falling not through conventional assault but through magical corruption that turned its own protective enchantments against the defenders. Most terrifying of all, he glimpsed the Night King himself, a figure of such supernatural power that his very presence could freeze the blood in living veins and turn the strongest warriors into shambling servants of death. The other's strategy was revealed to be far more sophisticated than simple conquest. They were not merely seeking to destroy human civilization, but to corrupt it, turning humanity's own achievements against itself. Cities would become graveyards where the dead outnumbered the living, and the very infrastructure of civilization would be transformed into weapons for spreading death and despair. The supernatural winter they brought with them was not just a change in weather, but a fundamental alteration of reality itself, a transformation that would make the world inhospitable to all forms of life that depended upon warmth and light. Through the prophetic visions, Qyburn experienced Aerys's growing understanding of what would be required to counter such a threat. Conventional military forces would be worse than useless against enemies that could turn fallen soldiers into additional troops for their own army. Diplomatic solutions were impossible with beings that viewed all human life as an obstacle to be eliminated. The only effective response would require weapons and strategies that most people would consider as monstrous as the enemies they were designed to fight. The wildfire caches that Aerys had ordered, constructed throughout King's Landing, were revealed to be positioned according to calculations that took into account the other's specific vulnerabilities to certain types of magical fire. When properly activated, these weapons would create a conflagration that could purify vast areas of the supernatural corruption that followed in the wake of the other's advance. The apparent madness of preparing to burn his own capital was actually a desperate but rational plan to deny the enemy a strategic prize that they could use to accelerate their conquest of the Seven Kingdoms. But the visions also revealed the tragic irony of Aerys' situation. The more clearly he perceived the approaching threat, the less capable he became of communicating his knowledge to others in ways they could understand and accept. His enhanced prophetic abilities came at the cost of his ability to function normally in present circumstances, creating a paradox that made him increasingly isolated, even as his need for allies and supporters grew more urgent. The final visions showed Qyburn the moment of Aerys' death, but not as it had been recorded in the official histories. Through the prophetic sight of the throne, he witnessed the Mad King's final conversation with Jaime Lannister, understanding for the first time the true meaning of that fateful encounter in the throne room of the Red Keep. Aerys had not been trying to burn King's Landing out of spite or madness when he gave his final order to burn them all. He had perceived through his enhanced prophetic abilities that Robert's rebellion was succeeding, that his death was imminent, and that the political chaos that would follow would leave the realm vulnerable to the supernatural threat that was already beginning to stir beyond the wall. His command to ignite the wildfire caches was a desperate attempt to create a weapon that could be used by his successors, even if they did not understand its true purpose. Jaime's decision to kill the king before the order could be carried out was not the heroic act of a knight protecting innocent civilians that it had been portrayed as in the songs and stories. It was a tragic mistake that eliminated one of the realm's most important defenses against the coming supernatural invasion. The young Lannister had acted according to his training and his understanding of right and wrong, but his ignorance of the larger situation had led him to prevent preparations that could have saved thousands of lives. The most devastating revelation came when Qyburn witnessed the Order's response to Aerys' death. The carefully orchestrated plans that had been centuries in the making were thrown into chaos by the loss of their enhanced king at the crucial moment when his abilities were most needed. Emergency protocols were activated, contingency plans were implemented, but the fundamental strategy that had been designed around having a prophetically enhanced ruler to guide the realm's response to the supernatural threat had to be completely reconsidered. Robert's rebellion had not been a spontaneous uprising against royal tyranny, but a catastrophic disruption of the Order's long-term preparations. The new king's hostility toward anything associated with Targaryen rule made it impossible to continue the enhancement programs openly, forcing the Order to work through even more indirect methods while precious time was lost. The political stability that Robert's reign had brought to the Seven Kingdoms was purchased at the cost of readiness for the supernatural conflict that was approaching faster than anyone realized. The visions revealed that the Order had been forced to accelerate their timeline dramatically after Aerys' death, implementing backup plans that were far less elegant and effective than their original strategy. The chaos of the War of the Five Kings was not merely a consequence of competing claims to the throne, but a deliberate strategy to weaken the established power structures that might interfere with the emergency measures that would soon be necessary. As the prophetic visions continued, Qyburn began to understand the true scope of the manipulations that had shaped recent events throughout Westeros. The death of Jon Arryn had been orchestrated to trigger the political crisis that would remove Robert Baratheon from power before his hostility to magical practices could interfere further with the Order's preparations. The war between the Starks and the Lannisters had been encouraged to eliminate leaders who might oppose the extraordinary measures that would be required to face the supernatural threat. Even more disturbing was the revelation that the Order had been infiltrating and manipulating the very institutions that were meant to protect the realm. The faith of the Seven had been gradually corrupted by agents who promoted interpretations of religious doctrine that would make the population more accepting of magical practices when circumstances required their use. The Citadel itself had been influenced to suppress knowledge that might interfere with the Order's plans while preserving information that would be useful when the supernatural conflict began. The climactic vision showed Qyburn the ultimate truth that Aerys had discovered through his enhanced prophetic abilities. The return of the others was not just a threat to be defeated, but a test that humanity had to pass in order to survive as a species. The cosmic forces that govern the balance between life and death, light and darkness, fire and ice, required periodic resolution through conflicts that determined whether civilization would continue to exist or be replaced by something entirely different. The Long Night had been one such test, and humanity had barely survived it through sacrifices that subsequent generations had been unable to comprehend or remember. The approaching conflict would be another test, possibly the final one, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of Westeros, but the future of human civilization throughout the known world. Aerys had understood that conventional morality and normal political considerations were inadequate guides for making decisions that would affect the survival of the species itself. His apparent madness had been the result of trying to function as a normal king while possessing knowledge that transcended normal human understanding. The terrible choices he had made, the monstrous preparations he had ordered, the paranoid behavior that had alienated his allies, all of it had been driven by his desperate awareness that failure to prepare adequately would result in the extinction of everything he had sworn to protect. As the visions finally began to fade, and Qyburn's normal consciousness returned, he found himself weeping for the tragedy of a king who had been willing to sacrifice everything, including his own sanity and reputation, for the sake of a realm that would remember him only as a monster. The Mad King had not been mad at all, but had been perhaps the sanest person in Westeros, cursed with knowledge that made normal behavior impossible and driven to actions that appeared insane to those who could not see what he saw. The three members of the Order's leadership watched in silence as Qyburn absorbed the full implications of what he had experienced. The comfortable certainties of his previous existence were gone forever, replaced by an understanding of reality that would require him to make choices that he could never have imagined before ascending the throne of prophecy. "Now you understand," the woman said softly, "why we do what we do, and why the methods we employ are necessary, despite their apparent cruelty. The stakes of the game we are playing are higher than most people can comprehend, and the consequences of failure are too terrible to allow normal moral considerations to interfere with our preparations." Qyburn nodded slowly, his mind still reeling from the visions he had experienced, but his understanding of the situation crystallizing into a clarity that he had never possessed before. The Order of the Dragon's Eye was not a criminal conspiracy, but humanity's last hope for survival against threats that transcended normal understanding. Aerys Targaryen had not been a mad king, but a tragic hero who had sacrificed everything for the greater good of his realm. The climactic revelation was complete, and Qyburn understood that he was now fully committed to a cause that would demand everything he had to give, and more besides. The comfortable life of academic inquiry was over, replaced by responsibilities that would test his courage, his intelligence, and his willingness to make choices that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The return of the others was no longer a distant possibility, but an immediate reality, and the realm's survival would depend upon the success of preparations that few people understood, and fewer still would be willing to support if they knew their true nature. The Game of Thrones had revealed its ultimate stakes, and Qyburn was now one of the players whose decisions would determine whether human civilization would survive to see another dawn. The aftermath of experiencing the prophetic visions left Qyburn fundamentally changed in ways that went far beyond simple knowledge acquisition. As he sat in the ancient chamber beneath Dragonstone, still trembling from the intensity of what he had witnessed, he understood that he had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The comfortable certainties of his previous existence as a scholar had been replaced by an awareness of cosmic forces and temporal patterns that most human minds were never meant to comprehend. The woman who had guided him through this transformation approached with a goblet filled with liquid that seemed to contain swirling galaxies of light, each drop pulsing with energy that resonated with the enhanced awareness he had gained through his contact with the throne of prophecy. "This will help stabilize your consciousness," she explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had guided others through similar experiences. The human mind requires time to process the temporal displacement that comes with prophetic sight. Without proper preparation, the knowledge you have gained could drive you to the same apparent madness that afflicted Aerys. Qyburn accepted the goblet with hands that still shook from the visions he had experienced, understanding now why the Mad King's behavior had become increasingly erratic as his prophetic abilities had grown stronger. The potion tasted of starlight and ancient magic, spreading warmth through his body that seemed to anchor his consciousness more firmly in the present moment, while allowing him to retain access to the expanded awareness he had gained. "The integration process," the Flame Prophet explained, settling into a chair that had been carved from what appeared to be crystallized time itself, determines whether someone who has experienced prophetic enhancement becomes a valuable asset or a dangerous liability. Aerys' tragedy was not just that he gained the ability to see the future, but that the political circumstances of his reign prevented him from receiving the support necessary to process what he was experiencing. Lord Commander Hightower moved to a section of the chamber where additional chairs had been arranged in a circle around a small table made from materials that seemed to shift between different states of matter. The isolation that prophetic sight creates is one of its most dangerous aspects. Those who can see multiple timelines simultaneously often find it increasingly difficult to relate to people who exist only in the present moment. Aerys' growing paranoia was not entirely unjustified, given his ability to perceive threats and betrayals that were still in the planning stages, but it also made it impossible for him to maintain the relationships necessary for effective leadership. As the stabilizing effects of the potion spread through his system, Qyburn began to understand how the Order's support network was designed to prevent the psychological deterioration that had ultimately destroyed Aerys' effectiveness as a king. The three individuals who had guided him through his transformation were not just leaders of the organization, but were themselves enhanced individuals who had learned to function despite possessing abilities that transcended normal human limitations. "The network we have built," the woman continued, "includes others who have undergone similar enhancement processes, individuals who can provide the understanding and support that prophetically gifted people require to maintain their sanity." Aerys' tragedy was that his enhancement occurred at a time when political circumstances made it impossible to provide him with such support openly. He was forced to bear the burden of prophetic knowledge alone, and the isolation ultimately contributed to the breakdown that made his death inevitable. The Flame Prophet produced a series of documents that showed how the Order had adapted their methods following the catastrophic loss of their enhanced king. The lessons learned from Aerys' experience have guided our approach to developing the next generation of prophetically enhanced individuals. Rather than concentrating all abilities in a single person who becomes an obvious target for political enemies, we have distributed the enhancement across multiple individuals who can support each other while maintaining their effectiveness in their assigned roles. The documents revealed a network of enhanced agents throughout Westeros, each possessing specialized abilities that complemented those of their colleagues. Some had been given enhanced perception that allowed them to detect supernatural phenomena that remained invisible to normal observers. Others had been trained to manipulate magical forces in ways that could counter the abilities of supernatural enemies. Still others possessed enhanced intuition that allowed them to make strategic decisions based on patterns that transcended conscious analysis. Jon Snow, Hightower said, his finger tracing a route on a map that showed the current situation at the Wall, represents our most successful application of these refined techniques. His Targaryen heritage provides the genetic foundation for prophetic abilities, while his upbringing in the North has given him the cultural background necessary to understand and accept supernatural threats that most Southerners would dismiss as superstition. His position with the Night's Watch places him at the crucial point where the supernatural threat will first manifest in its full intensity. The revelation that Jon Snow had been deliberately developed as an enhanced agent rather than simply being monitored by the Order added another layer of complexity to Qyburn's understanding of their long-term strategy. The young man's entire life had been orchestrated to prepare him for a role that he did not yet understand, just as Daenerys Targaryen had been guided toward her destiny as the prophesied hero who would lead humanity's resistance against the returning darkness. "The three heads of the dragon," the woman said, her voice taking on the rhythm of prophecy itself, represent not just individual heroes, but the coordination of different aspects of the magical heritage that will be required to restore the cosmic balance. Jon Snow brings the ice magic of the North and the defensive knowledge of the Wall. Daenerys Targaryen commands the fire magic of Old Valyria and the offensive capabilities of dragons. The third head represents the synthesis of these opposing forces, the individual who will unite ice and fire in the final confrontation with the others. Qyburn studied the documents and maps that revealed the current positions of these key figures, beginning to understand how their seemingly separate journeys were actually components of a larger strategy that had been planned for decades. "Who is the third head?" he asked, though something in the expressions of his companions suggested that he might not be prepared for the answer. "That remains to be determined," the Flame Prophet replied carefully. "The prophecies describe someone who will emerge when circumstances require their intervention, but the specific identity depends upon choices that have not yet been made. Several candidates exist, individuals whose bloodlines and experiences make them potentially suitable for the role, but the final selection will be determined by events that are still unfolding." The maps showed the current political situation throughout Westeros and beyond, revealing how the chaos of recent years had actually served the Order's purposes by eliminating obstacles and creating opportunities for their enhanced agents to assume positions of greater influence. The War of the Five Kings had removed kings and lords whose ignorance of supernatural threats might have interfered with necessary preparations, while the breakdown of traditional authority structures had created space for new forms of leadership to emerge. "The wildfire that Aerys prepared," Hightower said, pointing to locations throughout King's Landing where the caches remained hidden, "will still serve its intended purpose when the time comes to use it. The new rulers of the city remain unaware of its existence, but our agents maintain the knowledge necessary to activate the weapons when circumstances require their deployment. The Mad King's preparations were not lost with his death, but remain available for use by those who understand their true purpose." This revelation that Aerys' wildfire network remained operational and under the Order's control provided a crucial insight into how they had adapted to the political changes that had followed Robert's rebellion. Rather than attempting to influence the new regime directly, they had chosen to work around it, maintaining their capabilities while allowing others to believe they had eliminated the Targaryen threat. The timeline, the woman said, her expression becoming more urgent as the discussion turned to current developments, has accelerated beyond even our most pessimistic projections. The signs that we expected to appear gradually over several years are now manifesting simultaneously, indicating that the other's final awakening is imminent rather than merely inevitable. The luxury of careful preparation and gradual implementation is no longer available to us. The documents she produced showed reports from agents throughout the realm, detailing phenomena that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents or natural variations. Temperatures beyond the wall had dropped to levels that were impossible according to normal weather patterns. Animals throughout the northern regions were exhibiting behavior that suggested they were fleeing from something that terrified them on an instinctual level. Most disturbing of all, the magical protections that had maintained the wall's integrity for thousands of years were showing signs of systematic corruption that could only be the result of deliberate supernatural assault. The Night King, the Flame Prophet said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had studied this enemy for centuries, has begun the final phase of his return to the lands of men. The processes that we hoped would take years to complete are now happening in months, forcing us to implement emergency protocols that we had planned to keep in reserve until much later in the conflict. The images that appeared on the dragon glass surfaces throughout the chamber showed the true scope of the supernatural threat that was now fully awakening. The others were not merely preparing to invade, but were actively corrupting the magical foundations that separated their realm from the world of the living. The wall was not just a physical barrier, but a mystical construct that maintained the cosmic balance between life and death, and its systematic weakening threatened to unleash forces that could transform the entire continent into a realm of eternal winter and undeath. Daenerys Targaryen's dragons, Hightower explained, represent our primary offensive capability against these threats. But they will require support from magical practitioners who understand how to coordinate fire magic with the other forces that must be brought to bear. The enhancement techniques that were used on Aerys will need to be applied more broadly, creating a network of individuals who can perceive and respond to supernatural phenomena that remain invisible to normal observers. The revelation that the Order was preparing to implement widespread enhancement of prophetic abilities throughout their network marked a fundamental shift in their strategy. The careful secrecy that had protected their operations for centuries was being abandoned in favor of more direct action that would inevitably expose their existence to broader scrutiny. Your role in this final phase, the woman said, turning her attention back to Qyburn, will be to serve as a coordinator between the various enhanced individuals who will need to work together during the coming conflict. Your academic background provides you with the analytical skills necessary to synthesize information from multiple prophetic sources, while your recent enhancement gives you the temporal awareness needed to understand how different actions might affect the overall outcome. As Qyburn absorbed the implications of his new responsibilities, he began to understand that the Order was not just preparing for war, but was orchestrating the transformation of human civilization itself. The supernatural threat posed by the others was so fundamental that countering it would require changes in how society organized itself, how individuals related to magical forces, and how humanity understood its place in the cosmic order. The resolution of this crisis, the Flame Prophet said, his gaze fixed on distant visions that only prophetically enhanced individuals could perceive, will determine not just whether human civilization survives, but what form it will take in the ages to come. The old world of isolated kingdoms and limited magical understanding is ending, replaced by something that integrates supernatural awareness into the foundations of social organization. The maps and documents throughout the chamber began to display new information as the Order's network provided updates on rapidly developing situations throughout Westeros and beyond. The pieces of the Great Game were moving into their final positions, and the conflict that would determine the fate of human civilization was about to begin in earnest. Qyburn understood now that his investigation into the mystery of Aerys Targaryen's madness had been far more than an academic exercise. It had been the first step in a journey that would transform him from a simple scholar into one of the key figures responsible for guiding humanity through the greatest crisis in its history. The Mad King had not been mad at all, but had been the first casualty in a war that was now beginning to claim victims throughout the realm. The resolution was not an ending but a beginning, the moment when centuries of careful preparation gave way to direct action in defense of everything that the Order had sworn to protect. The Game of Thrones had revealed its ultimate stakes, and the final moves were about to be played by forces that transcended normal human understanding. The weeks that followed Qyburn's initiation into the Order of the Dragon's Eye brought revelations that continued to reshape his understanding of the world in ways that went far beyond the supernatural crisis that was approaching. As he traveled throughout Westeros under the cover of his scholarly credentials, meeting with other enhanced agents and observing the Order's preparations firsthand, he began to comprehend the true scope of the transformation that human civilization was undergoing. The enhanced awareness he had gained through his contact with the Throne of Prophecy allowed him to perceive patterns and connections that had previously remained invisible, not just in terms of supernatural phenomena, but also in the mundane political and social developments that were reshaping the Seven Kingdoms. Every conversation he witnessed, every decision made by lords and merchants and common folk alike, seemed to fit into larger designs that served purposes beyond the immediate understanding of the participants. In King's Landing, where he maintained chambers near the Red Keep under the pretense of continuing his genealogical research, Qyburn discovered that the Order's influence extended into every level of society with a thoroughness that would have been impossible to achieve through conventional means. Servants who cleaned the chambers of powerful lords were trained to observe and report on conversations that revealed political intentions. Merchants who supplied the royal household carried messages that coordinated activities across vast distances. Even the septons who provided spiritual guidance to the nobility had been selected for their ability to subtly influence the thoughts and decisions of those who sought their counsel. The realization that the Order had been managing not just major political events, but also the countless small decisions that shaped daily life throughout the realm, raised profound questions about the nature of free will and individual agency. How many of the choices that people believed they were making independently were actually the result of influences they could not perceive or understand? How much of what seemed to be natural social development was actually the product of careful manipulation designed to serve objectives that transcended normal human concerns? These philosophical implications became more than academic when Qyburn began to work directly with other enhanced individuals who had undergone various forms of prophetic or magical augmentation. Lady Melisandre, the Red Priestess who served Stannis Baratheon, possessed abilities that allowed her to perceive supernatural phenomena with remarkable clarity, but her religious training had channeled her insights into a theological framework that sometimes obscured the true nature of what she was experiencing. "The Lord of Light reveals truth through the flames," she explained, during one of their clandestine meetings in the hidden chambers beneath Dragonstone. "But the interpretations of that truth depend upon the understanding that the observer brings to the vision. I have seen the prince that was promised, the hero who will lead the fight against the darkness, but the identity of that figure remains fluid, shifting between different possibilities as circumstances change." Her enhanced abilities provided confirmation of what Qyburn had learned through his own prophetic experiences, but they also revealed the challenges that came with trying to translate supernatural insights into practical action. The future existed not as a fixed sequence of events, but as a constantly shifting array of possibilities, each dependent upon choices that had not yet been made, and circumstances that could still be influenced by those who understood how to perceive and manipulate the underlying patterns. Maester Marwyn, who had been operating as an Order agent within the Citadel for decades, possessed a different type of enhancement that allowed him to perceive the magical properties of objects and locations with extraordinary precision. His abilities had been crucial in identifying and preserving the ancient artifacts that would be necessary for the coming conflict. But they had also revealed disturbing changes in the magical environment of Westeros that suggested the supernatural awakening was proceeding even faster than the Order's most alarming projections had indicated. The barriers that separate the realm of the living from the lands of the dead are weakening throughout the continent, he reported during a meeting that brought together representatives from across the Order's network. Locations that have remained magically stable for centuries are beginning to show signs of corruption that can only be attributed to the Other's influence. The process that we expected would be confined to the area immediately beyond the wall is spreading southward through means that we do not yet fully understand. The implications of this development forced the Order to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how the supernatural conflict would unfold. Rather than having time to establish defensive positions and coordinate their response to a threat that would approach gradually from the north, they were facing a situation where the enemy's influence was already manifesting throughout the realm in ways that made traditional military strategies irrelevant. Lord Varys, the Master of Whisperers, whose network of informants had long been assumed to serve conventional political purposes, was revealed to be one of the Order's most important assets. His enhanced intuitive abilities, allowing him to perceive connections and patterns that escaped normal observation. His apparent loyalty to various kings and queens throughout his career had been a carefully maintained cover for activities that served the Order's long-term objectives rather than the immediate interests of any particular ruler. Information is the most valuable weapon in any conflict, he explained to Qyburn during a private conversation in the depths of the Red Keep. But supernatural warfare requires types of information that cannot be gathered through conventional means. The ability to perceive what enemies are planning before they have consciously decided upon their actions, to understand the emotional and psychological vulnerabilities that can be exploited, to recognize the moments when seemingly minor events will have consequences that reshape entire kingdoms. These capabilities provide advantages that no amount of conventional intelligence gathering can match. His network of little birds, the children who served as his eyes and ears throughout King's Landing and beyond, had been selected not just for their ability to remain unnoticed, but also for latent magical sensitivities that allowed them to perceive supernatural phenomena that would remain invisible to normal observers. The information they provided had been crucial in tracking the early signs of the Other's awakening, identifying locations where the barriers between different realms were beginning to weaken, and monitoring the activities of individuals whose bloodlines or abilities made them potentially important in the coming conflict. The revelation that so many of the figures who had shaped recent Westerosi history were actually enhanced agents of the Order forced Qyburn to reconsider everything he thought he understood about political causation and historical development. The War of the Five Kings, which had appeared to be the result of competing ambitions and personal grievances, was revealed to have been orchestrated to eliminate leaders whose ignorance of supernatural threats would have made them obstacles to necessary preparations. Robert Baratheon's death had not been the result of a hunting accident, but had been carefully arranged when it became clear that his hostility to anything associated with magic would prevent the implementation of measures needed to counter the approaching supernatural crisis. Ned Stark's execution had been allowed to proceed because his rigid moral code would have made him an opponent of the ruthless tactics that would be required for humanity's survival. Even Tywin Lannister's death had served the Order's purposes by removing someone whose intelligence and resources might have been used to oppose their activities once he understood their true scope. The transformation of human civilization, the Flame Prophet explained during one of their regular briefings, requires the elimination of individuals and institutions that cannot adapt to the new realities that supernatural awareness brings. The old world of limited magical understanding and isolated political entities is ending, replaced by something that integrates prophetic abilities and supernatural resources into the foundations of social organization. This transformation was already visible to those who knew how to look for it. Throughout Westeros, individuals with latent magical abilities were being identified and recruited into roles that would become increasingly important as the supernatural conflict intensified. The Faith Militant had been reorganized to include warriors who could perceive and fight supernatural enemies. The merchant guilds were being restructured to facilitate the movement of resources needed for magical practices. Even the brothels and taverns that served as gathering places for common folk were being influenced by agents who could shape public opinion and prepare the population for changes that would otherwise cause panic and resistance. The most profound implications of the Order's activities became apparent when Triben began to understand how they had been reshaping the fundamental relationship between rulers and subjects throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The feudal system that had governed Westeros for centuries was being gradually replaced by something that resembled the ancient Valyrian approach to governance, where magical abilities rather than hereditary bloodlines determined political authority. Daenerys Targaryen's rise to power in the Free Cities was not just the return of an exiled princess, but a demonstration of how leadership would function in the new world that was emerging. Her ability to command dragons represented a form of authority that transcended conventional political structures, while her prophetic abilities allowed her to make decisions based on insights that were unavailable to normal rulers. Her followers served her not just out of political loyalty, but because they could perceive the supernatural forces that she commanded and understood that their survival depended upon her success. The dragons are not merely weapons. The woman who had guided Qyburn's initiation explained during one of their sessions reviewing reports from across the Narrow Sea, but living symbols of the integration between magical and political authority that will be necessary for human civilization to survive the coming crisis. Those who can command such creatures possess abilities that make conventional forms of resistance or opposition irrelevant. The implications extended beyond questions of political organization to fundamental issues about the nature of human identity and social relationships. As more individuals underwent various forms of magical enhancement, the distinction between those who possessed supernatural abilities and those who remained limited to normal human capabilities was becoming a source of social stratification that would eventually replace the traditional divisions based on birth, wealth, or military prowess. Enhanced individuals, like Qyburn, found themselves increasingly isolated from normal human society, not because they chose separation, but because the gap in understanding and capability made meaningful relationships with unenhanced people difficult to maintain. The prophetic awareness that allowed them to perceive multiple possible futures made it challenging to engage in the type of present-focused interactions that characterized normal social relationships. The knowledge of cosmic forces and supernatural threats that they carried made casual conversation about everyday concerns seem trivial and meaningless. The loneliness that comes with enhancement, Lord Commander Hightower observed during one of their training sessions, is one of the prices that must be paid for the abilities necessary to protect human civilization. Those who can see what is coming must accept the isolation from those who cannot, just as those who possess the power to act must accept the responsibility that comes with that power. This isolation was not merely personal but extended to entire communities and regions that were undergoing supernatural transformation. The North, where the influence of the old gods and the proximity to the wall created conditions that enhanced magical sensitivity, was becoming increasingly different from the southern kingdoms where such influences remained weaker. The Iron Islands, where the drowned god's power resonated with ancient magical currents, were developing capabilities that set them apart from mainland Westeros. Even individual castles and cities were beginning to exhibit characteristics that reflected the magical properties of their locations and the supernatural abilities of their inhabitants. The deeper implications of what the Order had accomplished became most apparent when Qyburn began to understand how their activities had prepared the groundwork for changes that would extend far beyond the immediate crisis posed by the others. The supernatural conflict that was approaching was not just a threat to be defeated, but a catalyst that would accelerate the transformation of human civilization into something that could survive and thrive in a world where magical forces played an active role in shaping events. The return of the others, the Flame Prophet said during one of their final briefings at Dragonstone, represents both the greatest danger and the greatest opportunity that humanity has faced since the original Long Night. The crisis will force changes that would otherwise take centuries to implement, creating conditions where enhanced individuals can assume the leadership roles that their abilities make them suited for. The resolution of the supernatural conflict would not restore the old world, but would establish the foundations for something entirely new, a civilization that integrated magical awareness into every aspect of social organization and individual development. The Order of the Dragon's Eye had spent centuries preparing not just to defeat the others, but to guide humanity through the transformation that their defeat would make possible. As Qyburn prepared for his role in the final phase of this ancient plan, he understood that he was participating in something far more significant than a military conflict or political revolution. The deeper implications of what they were undertaking would reshape the fundamental nature of human civilization, creating possibilities and responsibilities that no previous generation had been required to confront. The Game of Thrones had revealed itself to be something far more complex and consequential than anyone had imagined, and the final moves were about to determine not just who would rule, but what form human society would take in the ages to come. The final truth about Aerys Targaryen's legacy emerged not from ancient documents or prophetic visions, but from the living consequences of his actions as they began to manifest throughout Westeros in ways that even the Order of the Dragon's Eye had not fully anticipated. As autumn deepened and the first supernatural phenomena began to appear south of the Wall, Qyburn found himself witnessing the activation of preparations that the Mad King had made decades earlier. Systems and strategies that revealed the true scope of his foresight and the devastating accuracy of his prophetic abilities. The wildfire caches hidden throughout King's Landing had been only the most obvious of Aerys's preparations. Through his enhanced awareness, Qyburn began to perceive a network of magical modifications that the king had ordered throughout the realm, changes to the fundamental structure of castles, cities, and strategic locations that would prove crucial in the coming conflict with supernatural enemies. These alterations had been subtle enough to escape detection by those who lacked prophetic sight, but they represented a comprehensive defensive strategy that anticipated threats most people still refused to acknowledge. Harrenhal, the massive castle that had been considered cursed since its destruction by dragonfire during Aegon's conquest, was revealed to have been deliberately modified during Aerys's reign to serve as a focal point for magical energies that could be channeled against supernatural enemies. The apparent decay and abandonment that had characterized the castle for decades had concealed ongoing construction and preparation that transformed it into something approaching a magical fortress designed specifically to counter the abilities of the others and their undead servants. The king understood that conventional fortifications would be useless against enemies that could raise the dead and manipulate weather patterns. Maester Marwyn explained as he guided Qyburn through chambers beneath Harrenhal that had been carved directly from the bedrock and lined with materials that resonated with protective enchantments. The modifications he ordered created a structure that could amplify the defensive capabilities of those who possessed magical abilities while providing protection against supernatural attacks that could penetrate normal barriers. The chambers revealed the true sophistication of Aerys's planning, incorporating architectural principles that had been lost since the doom of Valyria and adapting them to the specific geographical and mystical characteristics of Westeros. Dragon glass had been integrated into the castle's foundations in patterns that created networks of magical resonance extending far beyond the immediate structure. Channels carved in precise geometric arrangements allowed for the direction and focusing of magical energies in ways that could be used both defensively and offensively. Most remarkably, the entire complex had been designed to be operated by individuals who possessed enhanced prophetic abilities, with control systems that responded to mental commands rather than physical manipulation. Aerys had not only prepared these defenses, but had structured them to be most effective when used by people like himself, those who had undergone the enhancement process that allowed them to perceive and manipulate supernatural forces. He knew that he would not survive to use these preparations himself, the Flame Prophet observed as they examined the intricate control mechanisms that had been installed throughout the complex. The enhancements that gave him the foresight necessary to design these systems also showed him that his own death would be required to activate the political changes necessary for their eventual use. He built them for his successors, for those who would inherit both his abilities and his responsibilities. Similar modifications had been made to strategic locations throughout the Seven Kingdoms, each adapted to local conditions and designed to serve specific functions in a coordinated defense against supernatural invasion. The Sept of Baelor in King's Landing contained chambers where religious ceremonies could be used to amplify magical protections that would shield the population from supernatural corruption. The Citadel in Old Town had been restructured to serve as a repository for knowledge and resources that would be essential during the supernatural conflict. Even seemingly abandoned ruins had been prepared to serve as rally points and supply centers for resistance activities. The comprehensive nature of these preparations revealed that Aerys' apparent madness had concealed strategic thinking of extraordinary sophistication and scope. He had not simply been responding to immediate threats, but had been implementing a long-term defense strategy that took into account the specific capabilities of supernatural enemies and the resources that would be available to counter them. His enhanced prophetic abilities had allowed him to see not just what was coming, but also how it could be defeated, and he had used his position as king to make preparations that would have been impossible for anyone lacking royal authority. The tragedy of his reign, Lady Melisandre observed, during one of their conferences about the activation of these ancient defenses, was that the very abilities that allowed him to make these preparations also made it impossible for him to explain them to those who would need to understand their purpose. The gap between prophetic awareness and normal human consciousness created a communication barrier that prevented him from building the support network that would have been necessary for their optimal implementation. This isolation had been compounded by the political circumstances of his reign, particularly the growing tension with lords who interpreted his preparations as evidence of dangerous instability rather than necessary foresight. The rebellion that ultimately ended his life had been motivated partly by genuine concern about royal tyranny, but it had also been influenced by the inability of normal political leaders to comprehend the supernatural threats that justified extraordinary measures. The most devastating revelation came when Qyburn began to understand how Aerys' death had disrupted not just his specific preparations, but the entire timeline that the Order of the Dragon's Eye had been following for centuries. The king's prophetic abilities had been essential not only for making defensive preparations, but also for coordinating the complex sequence of events that would be necessary to counter the other's return. His early death had forced the Order to improvise solutions to problems that had been carefully planned for decades in advance. The wildfire network in King's Landing represents only a fraction of what he had envisioned. Lord Commander Hightower explained as they reviewed documents that showed the full scope of Aerys' intended preparations. His plans called for similar installations in every major city throughout the realm, creating a network of magical weapons that could be activated simultaneously to counter large-scale supernatural assault. The rebellion prevented the completion of these preparations, leaving us with defensive capabilities that are significantly reduced from what was originally intended. The incomplete state of Aerys's preparations had forced the Order to develop alternative strategies that were far more dangerous and unpredictable than their original plans. Rather than having a coordinated network of defensive installations managed by enhanced individuals who understood their purpose, they were now facing the prospect of supernatural conflict with makeshift solutions and improvised responses that carried much higher risks of failure. This situation had been further complicated by the political changes that followed Robert's rebellion, which had brought to power individuals who were not only ignorant of supernatural threats, but actively hostile to anything associated with magical practices. The new regime's determination to eliminate all traces of Targaryen influence had extended to the systematic destruction or abandonment of facilities and resources that would have been crucial for defending against supernatural enemies. The irony, Varys observed during one of their planning sessions, is that those who overthrew Aerys believing they were protecting the realm from tyranny actually eliminated many of the defenses that would have protected the realm from extinction. Their victory achieved short-term political stability at the cost of long-term survival capabilities. The consequences of this disruption were becoming apparent as reports arrived from throughout Westeros describing supernatural phenomena that the current leadership was ill-equipped to understand or counter. The Night's Watch, which had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength and capabilities, was reporting encounters with creatures that should not have existed according to conventional understanding. Temperatures throughout the northern regions were dropping to levels that suggested supernatural rather than natural causes. Most disturbing of all, there were reports of the dead rising in areas far from the wall, indicating that the other's influence was spreading through means that the disrupted defensive network could not contain. The acceleration of the supernatural threat, the woman who had guided Qyburn's initiation explained, is partly a consequence of the weakened state of the defenses that should have contained it. Aerys's preparations were designed to work together as an integrated system, and the destruction of key components has created vulnerabilities that the others are exploiting to advance their timeline. This realization forced the Order to confront the possibility that their carefully laid plans might be insufficient to counter the crisis that was now fully developing. The supernatural enemies they faced possessed capabilities that had been contained rather than defeated during the original Long Night, and the disruption of defensive preparations might have created conditions that would allow them to achieve victory that had been denied to them thousands of years ago. However, the final truth about Aerys's legacy also included elements that provided hope for humanity's ultimate survival. His prophetic abilities had allowed him to see not just the primary timeline that the Order had been following, but also alternative possibilities that could be activated if circumstances required different approaches. Hidden within his preparations were contingency plans and backup systems that could be implemented even under the worst-case scenarios that his death had created. He knew that his own actions might create the conditions that would disrupt his primary plans. The Flame Prophet revealed as they examined documents that had been sealed until the current crisis began to manifest. The enhancement process that gave him prophetic sight also showed him the paradox of trying to prevent futures that he could see clearly. His preparations included alternatives designed to function even if his primary strategy failed. These alternative approaches involved greater risks and required more extreme measures than the original plans, but they offered possibilities for victory that did not depend upon the coordinated defensive network that had been disrupted by his death. Instead, they relied upon the emergence of individuals with exceptional abilities who could serve as focal points for resistance activities that would be more flexible and adaptive than the static defenses that had been planned originally. Daenerys Targaryen's dragons represented the most important of these alternative resources, living weapons whose capabilities exceeded anything that had been available during the original Long Night. Jon Snow's position at the Wall provided crucial intelligence about supernatural developments that would be essential for timing countermeasures effectively. Most importantly, the network of enhanced individuals that the Order had developed provided a foundation for coordination and leadership that could adapt to changing circumstances in ways that the original defensive installations could not. The final truth about Aerys, Tyburn realized, as he absorbed the full implications of what he had learned, is that his apparent failure was actually another form of success. His death activated political changes that created opportunities for approaches that might prove more effective than his original preparations would have been. The Mad King's legacy was not just the specific defenses he had built, but the entire transformation of human civilization that his reign had set in motion. The supernatural crisis that was now beginning would force changes that would have taken centuries to implement under normal circumstances, creating conditions where enhanced individuals could assume leadership roles that their abilities made them suited for. The final phase of the conflict that was approaching would determine not just whether humanity survived, but what form human civilization would take in the ages to come. Aerys Targaryen had seen this future and had been willing to sacrifice everything, including his life and reputation, to ensure that humanity would have the resources necessary to navigate the transformation successfully. The truth about the Mad King was that he had never been mad at all, but had been perhaps the sanest person in Westeros, cursed with knowledge that made normal behavior impossible and driven to actions that appeared insane to those who could not see what he saw. His legacy would ultimately be measured not by the immediate consequences of his reign, but by the long-term survival of human civilization in a world where supernatural forces played an active role in shaping events. As winter settled over Westeros with an intensity that spoke of supernatural rather than natural causes, Qyburn found himself standing once again in the chamber beneath Dragonstone, where his transformation had begun, but now viewing the ancient space through eyes that had been forever changed by knowledge that most human minds were never meant to contain. The dragon glass table that had once seemed mysterious now revealed its secrets readily to his enhanced perception, displaying images of current events throughout the realm with a clarity that allowed him to understand the true scope of what was unfolding. The months that had passed since his initiation into the Order of the Dragon's Eye had brought revelations that continued to reshape his understanding of reality in ways that went beyond mere intellectual comprehension. He could see now how every event in his life, from his earliest scholarly interests to his chance discovery of inconsistencies in Targaryen genealogies, had been guided by forces that operated on scales of time and purpose that transcended individual human existence. The investigation that had begun as an academic exercise in historical research had revealed itself to be part of a pattern of awakening that was occurring throughout Westeros as the supernatural crisis intensified. Individuals with latent abilities were being drawn to roles and knowledge that would prove essential in the coming conflict, their apparent choices guided by influences they could perceive only dimly if at all. Qyburn's own journey from comfortable scholar to enhanced agent had followed a path that had been prepared for him long before he became aware of its existence. The awakening process. The woman who had become his primary guide within the Order, explained during one of their regular sessions, follows patterns that have been established through centuries of careful observation and planning. Those who possess the genetic markers and psychological characteristics necessary for enhancement are drawn to the knowledge and experiences that will prepare them for their eventual roles, though the process appears to be driven by their own curiosity and initiative. This understanding cast new light on every aspect of his previous existence, revealing connections and influences that he had been unable to perceive at the time they were operating. His attraction to genealogical research had not been merely academic, but had reflected an unconscious awareness of the importance of bloodlines in determining magical abilities. His willingness to pursue dangerous knowledge, despite institutional pressure, had demonstrated the psychological resilience that would be necessary for surviving the enhancement process. Even his social isolation and scholarly obsessions had prepared him for the type of existence that enhanced individuals were required to lead. The dragon glass mirror that Septa Morgana had given him, which he now understood had been provided to her specifically for the purpose of eventually reaching him, continued to display visions that revealed the current state of the supernatural conflict with increasing clarity and urgency. The others were no longer merely stirring beyond the wall, but were actively beginning their advance into the lands of men, their progress marked by phenomena that could no longer be dismissed as natural variations or isolated incidents. Temperature drops that exceeded anything in recorded history were spreading southward from the wall at a rate that suggested supernatural rather than meteorological causes. Animals throughout the northern regions were exhibiting behavior that indicated they were fleeing from something that terrified them on an instinctual level that transcended normal predator-prey relationships. Most disturbing of all, there were confirmed reports of the dead rising in areas that should have been far beyond the range of supernatural influence, suggesting that the others' corruption was spreading through means that existing defenses could not contain. The timeline has collapsed entirely. Lord Commander Hightower reported during an emergency meeting that brought together representatives from throughout the Order's network. The gradual escalation that our projections had predicted has been replaced by an acceleration that suggests the others have discovered ways to overcome the barriers that were supposed to contain their influence to the immediate vicinity of the wall. We are now facing the full intensity of their assault years earlier than our preparations were designed to handle. The maps and reports displayed throughout the chamber revealed a realm that was already beginning to experience the effects of supernatural warfare, though most of its inhabitants remained unaware of the true nature of what they were facing. Crop failures throughout the north were being attributed to unusually harsh weather rather than magical corruption of the land itself. Livestock deaths were being blamed on disease rather than supernatural predation. Even the growing reports of encounters with creatures that should not exist were being dismissed by most authorities as superstition or mass hysteria. This denial was not entirely the result of ignorance or political convenience. Keyburn had come to understand, but reflected the psychological difficulty that normal human consciousness experienced when confronted with phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. The enhanced individuals who could perceive supernatural threats clearly were increasingly isolated from the broader population, not just by their abilities, but by the unbridgeable gap between their understanding and that of those who remained limited to conventional awareness. The loneliness that comes with prophetic sight, he reflected during a quiet moment in his chambers, overlooking the volcanic landscapes of Dragonstone, is not just personal but represents a fundamental schism in human experience that will reshape social relationships throughout the realm. Those who can see what is coming must bear the burden of knowledge that others cannot share, while those who remain unaware will be forced to trust in guidance they cannot understand. This divide was already becoming apparent in the political chaos that continued to engulf Westeros as various claimants to the Iron Throne pursued conflicts that served the Order's purposes while remaining unaware of their true significance. The War of the Five Kings had eliminated many of the leaders who might have opposed the extraordinary measures that would be necessary for humanity's survival, while positioning enhanced individuals in roles where they could influence events more directly. Daenerys Targaryen's conquest of Slavers Bay had not been merely a young queen's attempt to build a power base for reclaiming her ancestral throne, but had served as a testing ground for the type of leadership that would be required in the new world that was emerging. Her ability to command dragons represented a form of authority that transcended conventional political structures, while her growing prophetic abilities allowed her to make decisions based on insights that were unavailable to normal rulers. Her dragons are not merely weapons, the Flame Prophet observed as they watched images of the young queen's activities in the dragon glass displays, but living symbols of the integration between magical and political authority that will be necessary for human civilization to survive the coming crisis. Those who can command such creatures possess abilities that make conventional forms of resistance or opposition irrelevant. Jon Snow's experiences at the Wall had similarly prepared him for responsibilities that went far beyond his apparent position as a bastard son serving in the Night's Watch. His encounters with supernatural phenomena had provided him with first-hand knowledge of threats that most people still refuse to acknowledge. while his unique bloodline gave him abilities that would prove crucial for coordinating the defense against enemies that operated according to principles that transcended normal military understanding. The convergence of these key figures was not coincidental, but represented the culmination of planning that had been ongoing for generations, their individual journeys guided by influences that had shaped their development from birth, while allowing them to believe they were making independent choices. The apparent randomness of their circumstances concealed patterns of manipulation that served objectives invisible to normal observation. As Qyburn reflected on the scope of what he had learned, and the role he had been chosen to play in events that would determine the fate of human civilization, he found himself grappling with questions that had no comfortable answers. The knowledge he now possessed had liberated him from many of the illusions that had constrained his previous existence, but it had also burdened him with responsibilities that no individual should have to bear alone. The enhanced awareness that allowed him to perceive supernatural threats and understand the cosmic forces that shaped historical events also made it impossible for him to return to the simple pleasures and concerns that had once given meaning to his life. Academic research, scholarly debate, the comfortable routines of institutional existence, all of these had been revealed as distractions from realities that demanded constant vigilance and preparation for conflicts that most people could not even imagine. "The price of knowledge," he wrote in his private journal during one of the long nights when sleep eluded him, "is the loss of innocence that makes normal human relationships possible. Those who see the cosmic game being played can no longer find satisfaction in the local concerns that occupy those who remain unaware of the larger stakes involved." Yet this burden was balanced by the understanding that his sacrifices, like those of Aerys before him, served purposes that transcended personal considerations. The supernatural crisis that was approaching represented not just a threat to be defeated, but an opportunity for human civilization to evolve beyond the limitations that had constrained its development for millennia. The integration of magical awareness into social and political structures would create possibilities that no previous generation had been able to imagine. The Order of the Dragon's Eye had spent centuries preparing not just to defeat the others, but to guide humanity through the transformation that their defeat would make possible. The enhanced individuals who would survive the coming conflict would serve as the foundation for a new form of civilization that incorporated supernatural capabilities into every aspect of organization and development. The reflection process. The woman who had guided his initiation explained, allows enhanced individuals to integrate their expanded awareness with their human identity, finding ways to serve the greater good, while maintaining the emotional connections that prevent complete isolation from their own species. The loneliness that comes with prophetic sight can be transcended through understanding that the sacrifices required serve purposes that extend far beyond individual concerns. This understanding provided a framework for accepting the burdens that came with enhanced awareness while finding meaning in the role that circumstances had assigned to him. The investigation that had begun as an attempt to understand one king's apparent madness had revealed the existence of forces and purposes that operated on scales that dwarfed normal human comprehension. But it had also shown him how individual choices and actions could influence outcomes that affected the survival of civilization itself. As he prepared for the final phase of the conflict that was now beginning in earnest, Qyburn understood that his transformation from scholar to agent of cosmic forces represented a pattern that was being repeated throughout Westeros as the supernatural crisis intensified. The comfortable certainties of the old world were giving way to realities that demanded new forms of understanding and new types of heroism from those who would guide humanity through its greatest challenge. The reflection and understanding that came with enhanced awareness was not an end in itself, but a preparation for actions that would require courage, wisdom, and sacrifice on scales that previous generations had never been required to contemplate. The final test of human civilization was beginning, and those who had been chosen to guide it through the crisis would need every advantage that knowledge and preparation could provide. The Game of Thrones had revealed its ultimate stakes, and the final moves were about to determine not just who would rule, but what form human consciousness would take in the ages to come. As dawn breaks over the ancient stones of Dragonstone, for what may be the final time before the great conflict begins, Qyburn finds himself walking through the chambers and passages that have become as familiar to him as the libraries of his youth, but which now hold meanings that transcend their physical existence. The volcanic fortress that had once seemed merely historical has revealed itself to be a living repository of human hope and determination, a place where the accumulated wisdom of centuries has been preserved and prepared for the moment when it would be needed most. The dragon glass mirrors throughout the complex no longer show him visions of possible futures, but reflect instead a present moment that contains within itself all the preparation and sacrifice that has led to this threshold between the old world and whatever is to come. In their polished surfaces, he sees not just his own transformed reflection, but the faces of all those who have contributed to this moment across the generations, from the dragon lords of old Valyria to the humble servants who have maintained the Order's secrets through centuries of careful silence. The morning light filtering through the narrow windows carries with it a quality of peace that seems almost impossible given the magnitude of what is approaching. Yet there is something deeply right about this tranquility, as if the universe itself is holding its breath before the great changes that will determine the shape of ages to come. The preparations are complete, the enhanced individuals have been positioned, and the ancient wisdom has been preserved and transmitted to those who will need it most in the trials ahead. Qyburn's journey from curious scholar to guardian of cosmic secrets has brought him to understand that the true meaning of knowledge lies not in its possession, but in its proper use when circumstances demand action. The investigation that began with simple questions about inconsistencies in historical records has revealed truths that reshape the entire understanding of human civilization and its place in the greater patterns that govern existence itself. The Mad King, whose apparent insanity had sparked this entire quest for understanding, now stands revealed as perhaps the most tragic hero in the annals of Westeros, a man who willingly sacrificed his sanity, his relationships, and ultimately his life to ensure that humanity would have the tools necessary to survive its greatest trial. His legacy lives on, not in the songs that remember him as a tyrant, but in the hidden preparations that continue to protect the realm even now, when the supernatural threat he foresaw has finally begun to manifest with terrible clarity. The wildfire that burns beneath King's Landing awaits its moment of purpose, no longer a symbol of madness, but a carefully positioned weapon against enemies that conventional forces cannot touch. The enhanced bloodlines that have been preserved and guided across generations are producing individuals whose abilities will prove crucial in the coming conflict. The network of agents and allies that has been built through centuries of patient work stands ready to coordinate humanity's response to challenges that transcend normal understanding. In the peaceful moments before the storm, Qyburn finds himself thinking of all the ordinary people throughout Westeros who will soon face terrors beyond their comprehension, but who will also witness acts of heroism and sacrifice that will inspire songs for generations to come. The farmers tending their fields, the merchants traveling their routes, the children playing in castle courtyards, all of them are part of the great web of human life that the Order has sworn to protect, and their survival depends upon preparations they will never know were made on their behalf. The dragons soaring above the free cities carry within themselves the fire of creation itself, living embodiments of the magical forces that will be needed to counter the supernatural winter that approaches from the north. Their young queen, still unaware of the full scope of her destiny, grows stronger in her abilities each day, guided by influences she has not yet learned to recognize, but which will prove essential when the time comes for her to assume her role in the great conflict. At the wall where the ancient barriers between the worlds of the living and the dead grow thinner with each passing day, another key figure prepares for responsibilities he does not yet understand. The bastard son who believes himself to be fighting wildlings and maintaining old traditions will soon discover that he stands at the center of a conflict that will determine the fate of all human civilization, his mixed heritage providing him with abilities that will prove crucial in the battles to come. The political chaos that has consumed the Seven Kingdoms for years, which has seemed to many observers to be nothing more than destructive ambition and pointless conflict, has actually served to clear away the obstacles that would have prevented the extraordinary measures that will soon be necessary. The old certainties and rigid structures that might have impeded adaptation to supernatural realities have been swept aside, creating space for new forms of leadership and organization that can respond effectively to unprecedented challenges. As the morning progresses and the light grows stronger, painting the volcanic landscapes of Dragonstone in shades of gold and crimson that seem to promise both hope and struggle, Qyburn feels a deep sense of completion settling over him. His transformation from scholar to guardian has reached its culmination, and he understands now that every choice he has made, every book he has read, every question he has pursued has been part of a pattern that extends far beyond his individual existence. The loneliness that comes with enhanced awareness, the burden of knowledge that cannot be shared with those who lack the capacity to understand it, these remain real aspects of his existence that will never entirely disappear. Yet they are balanced by the understanding that his sacrifices serve purposes that justify their cost, and that the isolation he experiences is shared by others who have accepted similar responsibilities across the centuries. The Order of the Dragon's Eye has succeeded in its primary mission of preserving the knowledge and capabilities that humanity will need to survive the return of its most ancient enemies. The network of enhanced individuals who have been developed and positioned throughout the realm provides a foundation for coordination and leadership that can adapt to whatever challenges emerge. Most importantly, the integration of magical awareness into the fabric of human civilization has progressed to the point where it can no longer be reversed, ensuring that humanity will enter the new age with the tools necessary to thrive rather than merely survive. In the quiet chambers where ancient wisdom has been preserved and transmitted across generations, Qyburn finds himself surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of civilizations that have faced similar challenges and emerged transformed by their experiences. The books and scrolls that line the walls speak of cycles of destruction and renewal that have shaped the development of consciousness itself, and of the role that enhanced individuals play in guiding these transformations toward outcomes that serve the greater good. The peace that fills these moments before the storm is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding, the deep recognition that everything that has happened has been necessary for bringing humanity to this point of readiness for the tests that lie ahead. The sacrifices that have been made, the prices that have been paid, the preparations that have been completed, all of these have meaning that transcends their immediate circumstances and connects to purposes that operate on scales of time and significance that dwarf individual concerns. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, bringing with it the warmth and light that will soon be challenged by supernatural winter, Qyburn prepares to leave Dragonstone for the final time as a student and seeker of knowledge. When he returns, it will be as a guardian and protector, one of the enhanced individuals who will guide humanity through the greatest crisis in its history and into whatever form of existence emerges from the resolution of that crisis. The investigation that began with questions about one king's apparent madness has revealed truths about the nature of reality itself, and about the role that conscious beings play in shaping the outcomes of cosmic processes that determine the fate of entire civilizations. The Mad King was not mad, but was perhaps the sanest person in his realm, cursed with knowledge that made normal behavior impossible and driven to actions that served purposes beyond the understanding of his contemporaries. The true victory will not be measured in battles won or territories conquered, but in the successful transformation of human consciousness to a level that can perceive and respond appropriately to the forces that shape existence itself. The integration of magical awareness into the foundations of civilization represents an evolutionary step that will enable humanity to participate more fully in the cosmic processes that govern the development of consciousness throughout the universe. In the gentle silence of dawn, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of ages and the presence of those who have dedicated their lives to preserving what is most precious in human experience, Qyburn finds himself filled with a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that has brought him to this understanding. The comfortable certainties of his former existence have been replaced by something far more valuable, the knowledge that consciousness itself is part of a greater pattern that connects all existence in ways that transcend the boundaries of individual identity. The Game of Thrones has revealed itself to be a reflection of larger games that operate on scales of cosmic significance, and the final moves that are about to be played will determine not just the political structure of Westeros, but the form that human consciousness will take as it enters the next phase of its development. The preparations are complete, the players are in position, and the ancient wisdom has been preserved and transmitted to those who will need it most. As the peaceful moments before the storm draw to their close, Tommen understands that he has been privileged to witness and participate in events that will be remembered as long as human consciousness endures. The truth about Aerys Targaryen's legacy is that it extends far beyond the immediate circumstances of his reign to encompass the entire trajectory of human development, and the sacrifices he made continue to protect and guide the species he died to preserve. The morning light grows stronger, painting the ancient stones of Dragonstone in colors that speak of both ending and beginning. And in that light, the future holds both challenge and promise, in measures that will test everything that humanity has learned about itself and its place in the greater patterns that govern existence. The peaceful conclusion is not an ending, but a doorway, the threshold between what has been and what is yet to come. And through that doorway, the enhanced guardians of human civilization prepare to guide their species toward whatever destiny awaits in the ages that lie ahead. The ancient fortress sleeps once more, its secrets safe in the hands of those who understand their true value. And in that sleep, there is peace that passes understanding, the deep rest that comes when great works are completed, and the burden of preparation gives way to the clarity of purpose that will guide the actions of those who have accepted responsibility for the future of consciousness itself.